know Cinderella, with the shoe and the pumpkin carriage and the stuff, and she's got a wicked stepmother and ugly stepsisters, and they're really mean to her, except sometimes one of them is nice now. Have you noticed that? Sometimes one of the stepsisters is nice. In Ever After, the movie with Drew Barrymore, one of the stepsisters was nice, but the other one was mean. And then in the Disney Cinderella sequels, Drizella stays mean, but Anastasia gets a whole redemption arc, and then she's nice now. And the newest season of Bridgerton, they just did a Cinderella retelling, so they have two stepsister characters, and one of them is mean, but the other one is nice. There's a good stepsister now sometimes. Actually, a lot of the time, once you start noticing the pattern, you start seeing examples of it pop up everywhere. And I've been wondering about that. I've been wondering why sometimes one of Cinderella's stepsisters is nice now. So I thought today together we could get to the bottom of that, and I'm sure it will take no time at all. Don't look at the runtime. I'm sure it'll take no time at all. So we're gonna have to start by taking a step back and defining parameters, because I don't want to talk about just any stepsisters. I want to talk about Cinderella's stepsisters. And given that Cinderella can have different names and still be Cinderella, we're gonna have to figure out exactly what it is we mean by Cinderella. Which turns out to be kind of a tough question. I've been talking a lot about fairy tales lately, and in a recent video I talked about the history of the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale. And even though there are many different versions of Sleeping Beauty and many different storytellers that have tackled it, it was still pretty easy to get a simple explanation, a simple definition of what the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale was. A line of fairy tales that originates in France that's about a princess who falls into an enchanted sleep, and then her curse is broken and she wakes up and then gets married and lives happily ever after. Cinderella is more difficult to pin down, partly because we have more to work with. The body of tales is so much bigger. There are more tales and they go back further in time. There are many more characters and there are distinct plot points that have to be hit. And then you have all this business about the transformation and the dress and the slipper and the running at midnight. But a story is more than a list of details, right? The tale of Cinderella is more than just slippers plus mice plus pumpkin carriage. That's what a Cinderella needs.
That's what a ship needs. But what a ship is freedom.
I want to talk about what a Cinderella is. In everyday conversation, if somebody referenced a Cinderella story, you would probably know what they meant. They probably meant one of two things. One meaning would be a sudden change in fortune, a rags to riches story, an underdog victory. In sports, for example, if you had a team that had every disadvantage, that everybody counted out, but somehow they made it to the end and they won, that would be a Cinderella story.
I got a 15 seed that's gonna rock your 2 seed right off the dance floor.
So that's one meaning. And then another concept that you might use Cinderella as a shorthand for is a romance plotline involving disguise and discovery. Two people meet and they are perfect for each other, but when they meet, one of them is pretending to be somebody that they're not. They are somehow in disguise, and the business of the romance is figuring out how they can be together as themselves. The logistical business of how they can find their way back to each other, and also the more important question of whether the relationship can work if they both see the other for who they really are. If somebody told me that there's a new rom-com out that is a Cinderella story, that's what I would assume they were saying. And actually, if you take those two concepts and combine them together, which is pretty easy to do, you just make the disguise the rags to riches element, and you throw in a magical benefactor, you basically have Cinderella, right? We start with an underdog, a young woman who is downtrodden and poor, but because of her magical benefactor, she has the opportunity to be in disguise temporarily as somebody of wealth. And in this disguise, she meets her true love. And immediately they are in love with each other, but how are they going to make this work? They're from different worlds. And eventually, there's a happy ending. Our male lead uses the slipper, or whatever is standing in for the slipper, to find Cinderella, and then they get married. Cinderella is elevated to high status and wealth, and they live happily ever after. That is almost Cinderella. It's almost Cinderella. And if Cinderella were just a rags to riches story or just a romance with the disguise and discovery plotline, then that would be it. You could take that plotline, have it take any form, put it in any setting or situation, and it would still be Cinderella. But I don't think it is. Our underdog character, our Cinderella, is not downtrodden for just any reason. She's not poor and oppressed because of chance, because of bad luck, or because of some villainous character that's come from far off. She didn't come to this status because of disaster. There are countless ways to create an underdog character. There are countless reasons that Cinderella could be in a bad situation. But when Cinderella is retold, and even when it's adapted into different settings, it's not 1,000 different reasons. It's always the same reason. It's always because of her family. Cinderella is poor, but not because she was born into a poor family. She was born into money, and she doesn't have access to that money, not because of bad luck or a gambling problem or a natural disaster or a tyrannical government. It's because her birthright is being withheld from her by her evil stepmother. Something has gone wrong in her family, in her immediate household, and that is the reason that she's so down on her luck. If her family weren't being like that, she would be doing fine, because Cinderella is about weird family stuff. Cinderella is about weird family stuff. And it's also about a romance of disguise and discovery. It's also about the rags to riches story. But without the weird family stuff, you don't have Cinderella. And while I'm pretty sure I'm the only one who chooses to articulate it this way, I am not the only one who thinks this. I have spent the last few weeks reading a lot of different takes on Cinderella. One of the reasons this video got so out of hand so quickly is because there's a lot of scholarship about Cinderella. I would be surprised if there is another tale that is not part of a religious text that has been dissected this much.
Abby, you want to come and play?
Oh, I can, Elmo. I have so much to do. These are my fairy tale books.
In the ATU index, Cinderella is a 510. Type 510 tales are referred to as persecuted heroine tales. Type 510 encompasses this huge body of interrelated tales. Because remember, this isn't a linear game of telephone where stories are directly passed and changed a little bit and then passed and changed a little bit in such a way that they create a thin line. These stories bounce around. They're told by one person and then they collide with another tale from another part of the world and they get remixed. And then another storyteller puts a spin on it. And then a third storyteller takes some of this and some of that. It's all a web. And in the web, we think of as Cinderella, this underdog, downtrodden young woman with weird family stuff going on, who has this disguise that eventually leads to her being elevated to a better status through marriage to some sort of prince. 510A is what we think of as Cinderella proper, because that's like Charles Perrault. Whereas type B, we now think of as like a cousin of Cinderella, that is Donkey Skin. In both of these types, Cinderella is in a bad family situation, but in general, in 510A, the stepmother is the problem. In 510B, the father is the problem. Not the stepfather, the father. I'm about to get into detail about fairy tales, which means we'll need some content warnings for, all the fun stuff in bedtime stories. Because in 510B, the father is not trying to make our persecuted heroine a servant, he's trying to make the persecuted heroine his new wife. And obviously those would seem quite different. The villainous stepmother is a very different character than the incestuous father, but they are both basically oppressive parental figures. In both of these cases, our persecuted heroine is the victim of really bad stuff happening in her family. And that's the thing that stays consistent even as we see so many different motifs, so many different plot points, so many different tones and themes, and even mediums. That's the thing that stays consistent. And the experts shall back me up on this. This guy, Bruno Bettelheim, he wrote a book in the 1960s called The Uses of Enchantment, where he basically takes Freudian psychoanalysis and applies it to fairy tales. And it's kind of dumb. Even by the standards of psychoanalysis, this guy didn't have any qualifications, and that's really saying something. So most of this he was really just making up. But this book has been very influential to the way people talk about fairy tales like Cinderella. He's constantly getting referenced, and he would back me up that these are stories about weird family stuff. To Bettelheim, Cinderella was a tale about sibling rivalry. and also about sex, because they were all about sex for him. In the 1980s, Neil Phillip put together this really cool collection of Cinderella tales, and he says this: "The stories that make up what has been called the Cinderella cycle, like many of the most frequently told and recorded folk tales, explore from various angles the knot or cluster of tensions inherent in the nuclear family." Jack Zipes is a very prominent scholar of folklore, and in his book, The Great Fairy Tale Tradition, he proposes a categorization for the Cinderella tale type that is the revenge and reward of neglected daughters. Specifically neglected daughters, so he is defining this heroine by her family position. What most of the tales, oral and literary, have in common is the conflict between a young girl and her stepmother and siblings about her legacy. Cinderella must prove that she is the rightful successor in a house in which she has been deprived of her rights. Another academic of folklore, Maria Tatar, wrote a really cool book called Off with Their Heads, Off with Their Heads, Fairy Tales and the Culture of Childhood. She talks about all these many changes that the Cinderella tale has undergone, all these different forms it can take, but remarkably stable across all of those forms are the elements of family drama and parental tyranny. In all these tale types, a persecuted heroine must flee home in order to escape a parental oppressor, either one who overwhelms her with too much paternal love, or who punishes her with too little maternal love, but rarely both. Another quite elegant quote that I like comes from Vox. This is pop culture writing. This isn't from a folklorist or scholar, but this article comes to a similar conclusion. It's subtitled, "Cinderella has endured for hundreds of years. That's because it gives us a way to talk about families." Cinderella parses fundamental family questions. How do we combine two families? And how do family structures survive when children stop being children? Which brings us to the Stepsisters. I have been curious about the Stepsisters for a while. I think they're intriguing and a little mystifying because why are they always there? When Cinderella is retold, especially when it's adapted to a very different setting or audience or genre or medium, a lot can change. These tales are more portable when they are simple, so often storytellers will whittle them down to essential elements to make it easier to carry over into a new work. So plot points can get shuffled around, characters can have different personalities, all these bits of business like the pumpkin carriage and the magical helper and the staircase and the midnight. If it doesn't work, they'll cut it loose. So much gets changed, so much gets left behind when this story is retold, except for the Stepsisters. The Stepsisters are basically always there, even though they have basically no plot importance. I mean, they lift right out.
You lift right out.
But nobody wants to do without them. Everybody keeps the Stepsisters, which tells me there's something essential about them. There's something essential to the heart of this story. Not the business of the plot, not the little details. There's something about the core of what this is a story about that you have to have Stepsisters for. You don't need Stepsisters for a rags to riches victory. You don't need Stepsisters for the romance about disguise and discovery. But you have to have Stepsisters if you're telling a story about weird family stuff. That is the lens through which I am going to look at Cinderella stories in this video, because that is the lens through which the role of the Stepsisters becomes clear, and hopefully the role of the good stepsister can become clear. Who are these characters? Where did they come from? What are they doing for us in the story of Cinderella? What happens when we change them? Why have so many people changed them recently? And how does this change the story of Cinderella if we change the character of half of this pair? So, let's talk about some fairy tales. Once upon a time, there was a cave chief called Wu, had 2 wives, one of whom died. And if you're wondering whether these wives were sequential or simultaneous, jury is out on that. But the one of the wives that died had a daughter called Xian, who was wonderful. She was very smart, and she was good at making pottery on the wheel, or perhaps at sifting gold, or sewing. She's good at something. Her father loved and cherished her, but then he also died. So then Xian was being taken care of by her father's other wife, which most English translations call her stepmother, while acknowledging that that might not be an accurate description of what their familial relationship is. I promise not all of it is going to be this hard. For lack of a better word, we shall say the stepmother mistreats Xian and makes her do all the hard work. This includes drawing water. And one day while Xian is drawing water, she draws out a fish, and it's just like a super cool fish, so she decides to keep it. It's tiny. It's like a goldfish, but it has bright red scales, and it's beautiful. And she puts it in a bowl of water and feeds it scraps from her meals, and it grows larger and larger, and she keeps having to put it in bigger and bigger bowls until eventually it gets too big to keep, and she has to return it to nature. And the stepmother says, "Haha, got her now," and puts on Xian's clothing and goes to the pond to say hi to the fish, and the fish pops its little head out just like it always does, and the stepmother cuts its head off. She kills the pretty red fish friend, and then she eats it. And the fish is 10 feet long by this point, so it's a lot of food, and it's twice as delicious as an ordinary fish. And the next day, Xian goes back to the pond. Presumably, she's wearing clothes now, and she goes to say hi to her fish friend, and the fish friend isn't there. But you know what? Is there? A man. The girl is literally crying by the pond that her fish friend is gone, and then a man comes down to the sky and is like, "Calm down." He says, "Listen, kid, your fish is dead. Your stepmother killed it and ate it, and she hid its bones underneath the dung pile so that nobody would know. What you're gonna do is go into the dung pile, dig up those bones, and then you'll have these bones, which will be great, because if you pray to them, you can get wishes granted." And she does this. She hides the bones away in her room and sometimes asks them for things, and she gets them. She gets extra food, but also dresses and jewels and lovely things. Soon after, it was time for the cave festival. And the stepmother goes to the cave festival, and then when she's gone, Xian gets on her fancy outfit, which includes a cloak made from kingfisher feathers, very fancy, and golden shoes. And she also goes to the festival looking amazing, and while she's there, her stepsister turns to her stepmother and is like, "That looks like Xian. Does that look like Xian to anybody else?" Yeah, there's been a stepsister the whole time. She's just coming up now, so if you were wondering why I was taking such time to retell a version of Cinderella that doesn't even have a stepsister, I'm not. There's a stepsister in this one. She's apparently been here the whole time, and she has Xian's number. Xian realizes she's been made, so she leaves the festival in a hurry, leaving behind, wouldn't you know, one of her golden shoes. So the king just has this shoe, and he tells his friends in his court, LOL, try on this shoe. And nobody can wear the shoe. Nobody can fit in it because it's so obscenely tiny. And the king's like, "That's hot." And eventually he comes upon the dwelling of Xian and her stepmother and her apparent stepsister, finds Xian there, makes her try on the shoe, and wouldn't you know, it fits. The king takes Xian and her fish bones back to his castle. This next sentence is my favorite, so I'm going to read directly from my preferred translation. "The stepmother and stepsister were shortly afterwards struck by flying stones and died. The cave people were sorry for them and buried them in a stone pit, which was called the Tomb of the Distressed Women. The man of the cave made mating offerings there. Any girl they prayed for there, they got." So that is the tale of Xian, which is generally agreed to be the earliest surviving recorded version of Cinderella. This version of the story was first recorded by Duan Chengxi in a book whose title is usually translated as Miscellaneous Morsels, which I find so delightful. So this version dates from about 860, but we have every reason to believe that the actual story is much older than that. But it's not until Xian that we have a complete story that is recognizable as Cinderella, that has all the important elements, lots of different ethnic groups with different storytelling traditions in southern China and beyond got their hands on this before the version that we are able to read. So it wouldn't be correct to say that this story is from any one spot, any one community or culture, but it would be correct to say that the origin of this story is Asian. So for our purposes today, the story of Cinderella is developed in Asia a long, long, long time ago, and then somewhere around the 16th century, it starts to move west, and it hits Italy first, because that's where the boats go first. The tale passes through merchants and sailors and missionaries, all these really, really good folk storytellers, until eventually, in the 1630s, it gets written down and we get our first recorded European Cinderella. And it is written down in a very famous book you might recall from the Sleeping Beauty video. It's by our old friend Giambattista Basile. Basile. It's the Pentameron! In the Pentameron, the story is called The Cat Cinderella, and don't get excited. It's not what you are dreaming, but it is very fun, so let's talk about it now. You ready? Once upon a time, there was a prince who had a daughter called Zezola, and he loved her so much. He was obsessed with her, and Zezola was quite good at sewing, so he hired her a sewing tutor to improve her skills. Now, Zezola's mother had unfortunately passed away, and her father, the prince, decided to remarry, and he marries the worst woman ever. She is, quote, rambunctious, evil, and diabolical. And she hates Zezola. She's always giving Zezola mean looks and like scoffing at her, making faces. It really doesn't sound that bad, to be honest, but Zezola was very upset by it, and she was complaining to her sewing teacher about her horrible, wicked stepmother. And she says she hates having this woman for her stepmother. I wish you, my dear sewing teacher, who's so good to me, I wish you were my new stepmother. Zezola keeps talking about this until this sewing teacher is basically overcome by the devil and says, okay, I'll be your new mommy. The teacher says, Zezola, you're going to ask your stepmother to go get you a dress out of this chest, okay? You're going to hold the lid of the chest for her while she leans into it to look. And then at exactly the right moment, you are going to drop the lid on her head so that it will break her neck and kill her. And Zezola is like, you got it, boss. Here I go. Now kick her, sir.
And I'd kick her, sir.
Zezola immediately does this, succeeds in doing her little murder, and then waits out the mourning period for her stepmother, and then begins the second phase of the plan she has hatched with her teacher. She starts really buttering up her father, the prince, who loves her and wants to please her, and she starts dropping hints about how much she loves her sewing teacher, and how amazing it would be if she had a mom that was like her sewing teacher. The prince thinks she's joking, but then Zezola starts poking him with sewing pins, and so he's like, okay, I guess you're serious. So he says, fine, I will marry the sewing teacher, whose name we now learn. Her name is Carmosina. They get married and have a huge celebration, and while the newlyweds are involved with each other, could mean anything, Zezola goes out onto the terrace and she sees a dove. And the dove's like, let me know if you need anything. For the first week, everything is great. Carmosina, the new stepmother, remembers her promise to treat Zezola very well, and she does, but then she kind of gets tired of that, and she realizes she doesn't need anything from Zezola anymore, and she can kind of do whatever she wants. And what she wants to do is move in her 6 daughters. She's had 6 daughters the whole time that she has kept secret from everybody, including her husband. But there's nothing he can do about it now, so she brings them to the palace. Their names are Imperia, Calamita, Fiorella, Diamante, Colombina, and Pasquarella, in case you forgot we were in Italy. And the stepmother uses all of her wiles to ingratiate these stepsisters in with the prince, and soon the prince forgets about his first daughter, Zezola. He doesn't care about her anymore, and he lets the step family treat her however. And however is bad. One day, the prince has to go to Sardinia on urgent business of state, and he asks all of his daughters what they would like as a gift. The present is a date tree, and a fairy comes out of it and says, what can I do for you? And Zezola says, I wish I could get out sometime. Soon after, there was a festival day, and the 6 daughters get all dressed up in all of their finery, and they and the stepmother leave, and Zezola's like, this is my chance. She runs to the tree, and she says the rhyme, and all at once she is dressed in beautiful clothes and adorned like a queen, and she goes to the festival, and her 6 sisters see her, and they don't recognize her, but they're so jealous. And who else notices Zezola at the festival? Why, the king, of course. He goes around, they try the slipper on every single woman, and none of them fit. And so he calls for silence, and he says, one of you is lying to me. He says, you are all gonna come back here tomorrow, and I better see all the women of the kingdom. The prince actually says, well, technically, I guess I do have a daughter, but you don't want her here. She's worthless and a disgrace. And yes, that is the actual text. And the king has to be like, did I stutter? So the next day, they all come back, and Zaizola gets to come. They have another feast, everybody has dinner, they all sit down, we do the slipper test again, and oh my goodness, it fits Zaizola. The king takes up Zaizola in his arms and sits her underneath a canopy and has everyone present bow and curtsy as he crowns her their queen. When the sisters saw this, they burst with rage and did not have the stomach to bear the agony of their breaking hearts, so they slipped off home to their mother, confessing, in spite of themselves, that you must be mad to oppose the stars. The end. Now I know what you're wondering. These 6 sisters, are they ugly? I mean, I gotta know, that's all I really care about in these stories, is the stepsisters. I didn't need to tell you all that other stuff. The stepsisters in Basile Cinderella are never described as beautiful, but I am seeing mixed opinions on whether they are described as ugly. The translation I was reading from is by Jack Zipes, who does use the word ugly. There is a line where he says, later, when the ugly sisters arrived, they told her all about the beautiful things they had seen to vex her. But that is the only sentence where that word pops up, and I have not seen that word pop up in any other translation. In the Richard F. Burton translation, the line sounds like this. And when those witches, her stepsisters, arrived home, they said many things in praise of the festival, of what they had done and what they had seen to cause her vexation, as they supposed. John Edward Taylor has a translation pretty similar to the Zipes one, but he calls them wicked sisters in the spot where Zipes says ugly sisters. The word in Italian is arpi. Arpi delle Sorelle. Google recognizes that as harpy. I was not able to find any full English translations of the story that choose to translate this phrase as harpy-like sisters. It's obviously a bad thing, it's a negative description Basile is giving these sisters, but the exact nuance of what kind of insult this is the kind of thing that gets lost to time. I mean, if you speak Italian, feel free to let me know what you think about the right way to translate it, but I fear that even speaking Italian in 2020 would not fully give me the ability to understand what Basile meant in the 1600s. When you're working with translated texts, you really can't get hung up on individual word choice, which is frustrating when this is such an important word for me, because whether the stepsisters are horrible and pretty or horrible and ugly is a matter of some interest to me. I've always found the idea of the ugly stepsisters intriguing because she's the wicked stepmother, right? But they're not the wicked stepsisters. They're the ugly stepsisters. In addition to being a story about weird family stuff, Cinderella is also a story about beauty in ways that sometimes get overlooked. And whether Cinderella's foils are beautiful or ugly can really change the point of view of the story. So if we're keeping track, there was one stepsister. There was one stepsister in that story recorded in China in the 860s. She lived in caves and didn't really do very much. And then we fast forward to the 1630s in Italy, and we have 6 stepsisters. And they're a lot, they're kind of a mess. And they're not very nice, but they're certainly not as horrible as the stepmother. And they are of indeterminate attractiveness. So what happens now, to the best of my understanding, is that Cinderella, the story of Cinderella, bounces around the continent for a while. It starts popping up in all sorts of European oral folklore traditions, mixing and melding with those local traditions, and then sometimes it goes back east. It returns to Asia with European influences and spurs new evolutions of the story. A lot of these stories don't get formally recorded until like the 1890s, but before that happens, something really, really cool happens to Cinderella and a bunch of other fairy tales. These stories spend some time in France, not as part of the oral tradition of folk storytellers, but as part of French salon culture. I will quote Jack Zipes here. French women in the salon scene almost single-handedly transformed the Italian and Oriental tales, as well as oral tales, into marvelous fairy tales that were serious commentaries on court life and cultural struggles at the end of the 18th century in Versailles and Paris. These writers, who are primarily upper-class women, are writing in a very social, conversational way. They are passing ideas back and forth, and the medium for those ideas just happens to be the stories of fairy tales. The queen of these writers was Madame d'Aulnoy, who is super fascinating, and we don't have time to get into that, but just know that she invented Prince Charming. She invented Prince Charming. She also coined the term fairy tale. She's why we call them fairy tales. And in fact, the works of this community of writers basically gives us our modern conception of what a fairy tale is. And these fairy tales are primarily written works. These are literary tales. The ones I've already talked about, those are oral stories that somebody was told and then decided to write down. It's more of a record or a transcript than it is the work itself. So I would like to talk about Finette Cendron, which is essentially d'Aulnoy's Cinderella. It's cunning cinders in English usually. And it goes a little something like this. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen who were so bad at their jobs, they managed their finances so badly that they fell into complete ruin, had to sell all of their fine things and move out of the castle, and they were like, what are we going to do? And the queen is like, I know what we need to do. Job 1 is to cut loose these freeloader kids. They had 3 daughters who were accustomed to being fine ladies, and therefore ended up rather lazy. So the king says, fine, tomorrow, make up an excuse, take the girls as far away as you can, and leave them there. And while they are making this plan, the youngest daughter, Finette, is listening at the door. She's like, I need to talk to my fairy godmother about this, and I want her to be in a good mood, so I'm gonna bake her a cake. Finette bakes her cake, and then she combs out the fairy godmother's hair, and the fairy godmother gives her a skein of thread that will never break. And she says, tomorrow when you leave, tie one end to the door so that you can find your way back home. She also gives her a bunch of fancy dresses, and then the horse takes Finette home. The next morning, the queen goes to her 3 daughters and says, everybody get up, we're gonna go see my sister, super far away. They set out, and Finette holds back just a little bit so that she can let out her trail of thread, and eventually they come to a little clearing in the woods, and the queen says, why don't you girls go to sleep? We've been walking all day, you go to sleep, I will watch over you, don't even worry about it. The older 2 sisters go to sleep, but Finette only closes her eyes and pretends to sleep and watches the queen leave, watches her mother abandon her forever. If I were an ill-natured girl, said she to herself, I should go home directly and leave my sisters to die here, for they beat me and scratch me till the blood comes. But notwithstanding all their malice, I will not abandon them. She wakes up her sisters and tells them what happened, and they are like, oh my gosh, Finette, please take us with you. We'll do anything. We'll give you all our nice things. And Finette's like, well, no, you won't, but I'll help you anyway. But no, you won't. Finette follows the thread and leaves her ungrateful older sisters home. And they come in and the queen's like, oh, it's you guys. I'm so glad you found your way back. I just came back here because I forgot something. And everybody just pretends that what just happened isn't what just happened. And they go up to their rooms and Finette's like, so you guys are going to give me that doll you promised? You know, you said you'd give me your stuff and all your toys if I led you back home. Where's my doll? And the sisters are like, first of all, no. Second of all, we're going to beat you with sticks. And they beat her with sticks. And then Finette goes and listens at the door again and hears her parents plotting to abandon her again. She goes back to see her fairy godmother again, cooks her a nice meal and asks her for advice. And the fairy godmother says, well, your first problem is you need to stop bringing your sisters home with you. They suck for real. But here you go. Here is a sack of ashes. What you're going to do is leave a trail of ashes to find your way back home. The next morning, the queen says, girls, we're going on a trip. The king is sick. We're going to get a special flower for him. It's very far away. Let's go. They journey out. Finette hangs back and lays her little trail with her bag of ashes. They all go to sleep. Finette just pretends. The queen abandons them. Finette wakes up her sisters, says, hey, guess what? Mom abandoned us again. The sisters are like, please help us. And Finette's like, I really shouldn't. You guys are the worst. But I guess I'll help you again. Now, I know the plan didn't work the first 2 times, but this is a fairy tale, so we're gonna try it one more time. The queen's like, I am going to take these girls so far away that they will never be able to find their way back home. And Finette is worried because she didn't follow her fairy godmother's instructions. So she doesn't want to go back and see her because she's like, she's going to be really mad and probably not even help me. And her older sisters are like, don't worry about it. We know all the tricks now. They found a bunch of peas. They have a bag of peas and they're like, we're going to leave a trail of peas to find our way back home. So that's what they do. They set out the next morning. They leave their little trail of peas. The older sisters are not worried. Finette's very, very worried. They travel so far. They do the whole game where they pretend to go to sleep. And when they wake up, wouldn't you know it, the trail is gone because things eat peas. Birds and critters and stuff got the peas overnight, and now there's no trail for them to find their way back home, and they try, but they get completely lost, and they're somehow lost in the desert now and see a beautiful chateau off in the distance. It looks so luxurious, so wealthy. They decide they're gonna go there. And the older sisters get all dressed up because they went snooping through Finette's stuff and saw the bag of fine dresses that she got from her fairy godmother, which apparently contained 2 dresses and only enough accessories for 2 people, so she doesn't get to wear fancy clothes. The 3 of them proceed down to the chateau, the 2 of them looking like fine ladies, and Finette looking like their servant. But when they get there, oh no, it's an ogre's chateau. There's an ogre and his ogre wife, and they're like, great, we're gonna eat you. So Finette starts doing her job, she's getting ingredients together. She heats up the oven and she throws butter in the oven. And she's like, well, this is how you tell if the oven's hot enough. You throw some butter in there and then you taste it. I'm not super sure how that works, but the ogre believes it. And she's like, well, since your oven is so huge, I actually can't reach back to get the butter. Could you do that for me so we can see that the butter's ready? And so the ogre reaches into the oven and you bet it, she cooks the ogre. When the ogress came to the oven, she was astounded to find her husband a mountain of cinders. Then Finette sweet talks the ogress by telling her she will make her so pretty she'll do her hair so that she can catch a much better man. And then takes a hatchet to her from behind. And now they have a chateau. So these 3 girls are having a great time. They have the run of the place. They all have a beautiful bedroom and there's lovely clothes, although none that fit them, but there's a lot of food and that's great. But the older sisters decide that they are not satisfied because what they really want are husbands. So they get themselves all dressed up to go seek a town and find a rich man. And they tell Finette she has to stay and take care of the house and do the cooking and cleaning or they will beat her with sticks. And poor Finette just sits down and cries. The older sisters keep going out and meeting amazing lords and having wonderful parties, but one day while Finette is at home in the chateau cleaning, she stumbles upon this trove of jewels and coins and dresses, human-sized dresses. So one night she puts one on and beautifully adorns herself, and she goes to the ball where her sisters are dancing, and they don't even recognize her, even though she's not wearing a mask. She just looks so good. She calls herself Cendron. Finette sneaks away just before the ball ends so that she can change out of her fine clothes and back into her rags and cinders before her sisters come home full of stories about the beautiful lady at the ball. Finette keeps dressing in new beautiful dresses and going to these balls and making a stir. She's a sensation, and then one night she stays a little too long and she is in such a rush to get home that she loses a shoe. And the next morning a prince was out hunting. It is Prince Chéri, the king's eldest son, and he finds the slipper. He looks at the shoe and it's so small and he's like, that is so hot. And they say, everybody is gonna try on the slipper. All the women in the kingdom. On hearing this, everyone washed their feet with all sorts of waters, pastes, and pomades. Some ladies actually had them peeled, and others starved themselves in order to make their feet smaller and prettier. Everybody tries on the shoe, and nobody can fit into it. And the older sisters go to try on the shoe, and Finette's like, where are you going? And they're like, well, there's a shoe. We're all gonna try on the shoe so that we can be queen. Finette realizes, oh my god, that's my shoe. She tries on the slipper. Of course, it fits. And just as the cherry on top, she pulls out the other matching slipper. About this time, the older sisters finally show up, because they were coming on foot, and Finette welcomes them in. She embraced them tenderly, and then presented them to the queen, saying to her, Madam, these are my sisters. They are very amiable, and I request you will love them. They were so confused at the kindness of Finette they could not utter a word. She promised them that they should return to their own kingdom, which the prince would restore to their family. At these words, they threw themselves on their knees before her, weeping with joy. And the moral of the story is kind of a clumsy little poem. I assume it's better in the original French, but basically it's kill them with kindness. If you want to seek revenge on people who deserve it, think instead of the example of little Finette. Treat those who treat you poorly well, and that will be worse for them than if an ogre ate them. Now, this style of fairy tale coming from the French salon writers was developed and pioneered by women and mostly written in by women, but not exclusively women. You did have the occasional guy, including a guy you might have heard of called Charles Perrault. And he released a collection in 1697 that also had a Cinderella story. He called this one Cinderella, or The Little Glass Slipper. And this should be easy, you should already know this one, but just in case, once upon a time, there was a gentleman who took the haughtiest and proudest woman in the world for his second wife. She had 2 daughters with the same temperament and the exact same appearance. On the other hand, the husband had a daughter whose gentleness and goodness were without parallel. She got this from her mother, who had been the best person in the world. Of course, as soon as the wedding had taken place, stepmother becomes really, really mean and makes her stepdaughter do all the hard chores. Whenever she finished her work, she used to sit down near the chimney corner among the cinders. Consequently, she was commonly called Cindertail. Translations like to get silly with this. Some of them say cinder britches. Some of them say things that are very impolite. The second daughter, however, was not as malicious as her elder sister, and she dubbed her Cinderella. Nevertheless, Cinderella looked 1,000 times more beautiful in her shabby clothes than her sisters, no matter how magnificent their clothes were. If we're paying attention to the details, did he call the stepsisters ugly? Not really. He just said that they weren't nearly as beautiful as Cinderella. They might be ugly, but they might be just ordinary. We also see 2 stepsisters with different behavior. That's kind of new. One of them is very mean. Is the other one nice? No. The other one is not as mean as the first. Now comes the news that the prince is holding a ball and everybody's invited, so there's a great activity of getting ready, and this makes so much more work for Cinderella. The stepsisters are vain and obsessed with themselves and can't stop thinking and talking about what they're gonna wear and how they're gonna do their hair. They summoned Cinderella and asked her opinion, for she had excellent taste. Cinderella gave them the best advice in the world and even offered to dress their hair for them, which they were glad to accept. Any other person but Cinderella would have messed up their hairdos, but she was good-natured and dressed them to perfection. They leave for the ball and Cinderella cries because she wants to go too, and then her fairy godmother appears to her and starts doing all sorts of fun magic. Her instructions seem strange, but Cinderella follows them without question, and she turns a pumpkin into a carriage and finds mice and turns them into horses. A rat becomes the coachman and some lizards become the footmen. Finally, she transforms Cinderella's rags into a beautiful gown of silver and gold and jewels with glass slippers. And Cinderella goes to the ball with the warning that all of this magic will end at midnight, so she has to get home by then. Cinderella arrives at the ball with great drama. Fashionably late, she gets everybody's attention. A hush falls over the ballroom because everyone has just never seen anything so beautiful, including the king's son. He is instantly smitten and wants to dance with her all night. A very fine supper was served, but the prince could not eat anything because he was so engrossed in watching her. She went and sat beside her sisters and showed them 1,000 civilities. She shared oranges and citrons with them that the prince had given her, and her sisters were quite surprised because they did not recognize her at all. Cinderella rushes home and she beats the rest of the family, and then they come yapping all about this extraordinary woman that there was at the ball, but nobody knows who she is. And Cinderella's pretending to be very intrigued by this, and she says, "Oh, I would love to see this mysterious maiden. Could I borrow one of your dresses to go back tomorrow?" And the stepsisters laugh at her. Of course she couldn't. "Indeed, I like that. Lend my gown to a dirty Cindertail like you. I'd have to be quite mad to do something like that." And for the first time, we get a name for one of these girls. It is Géotte. Perhaps it's Charlotte sometimes. I have seen a lot of people attribute this name to the slightly less mean stepsister. The slightly nicer one is called Charlotte, but no, in the text you can see this is the older one speaking because she calls her Cindertail. The next day they go to the ball. Cinderella waves goodbye to her stepsisters and then goes to her fairy godmother, gets her own magical adornment, and goes to the ball where the prince is very excited to see her. She almost stays too long, but finally gets away, leaving behind one glass slipper in her hurry. And at the stroke of midnight, all of her fine things disappear, except for the other glass slipper. The prince retrieves the slipper, decides he must marry this lady, so he embarks upon the slipper quest and says every maiden in the kingdom must try it on. Soon it was taken to the 2 sisters, who did their utmost to force one of their feet into the slipper, but they could not manage to do so. Cinderella asks to try, and they laugh at her, but of course it fits. Just in the moment she is recognized, the fairy godmother comes back and transforms Cinderella again into the beautiful clothes, and everyone finally realizes it was her at the ball. The two sisters then recognized her as the beautiful person they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet, begging her pardon for the harsh treatment they had made her endure. Cinderella raised and embraced them, saying that she forgave them with all her heart and begged them to love her well in the future. Cinderella, who was as kind as she was beautiful, gave her sisters apartments in the palace and had them married the very same day to two great noblemen of the court. The moral of the story, according to Perrault, is that sweetness and kindness are much more important than beauty in winning a man. And I'm not sure that that's what the story is about, but okay. Hey, why didn't you guys tell me one of my books fell down? I fixed it now, but it's gonna be, the continuity is gonna be all messed up. I want to tell you about a version that was collected in the 1890s in Portugal called the Hearth-Cat. Don't get excited, it's still not a cat. This one begins, once upon a time, there was once a schoolmistress who was a widow and had a daughter who was very plain. This mistress had a pupil who was very pretty and the daughter of a traveler. The schoolmistress convinces the pretty daughter to convince her father to marry the schoolmistress, and the biological mother is already out of the picture, so there's no murder involved, but it is kind of tricksy. Once the wedding has taken place, anytime the father is not around, the stepmother of course treats the pretty daughter very horribly. There's business with a magical cow that the girl becomes friends with, and of course the stepmother kills the cow, but inside the cow's entrails there's like magic gold that grants wishes. But then we forget about the cow because the pretty girl finds a fairy house and she tidies up the fairy house, and that makes the fairies very pleased, so they bestow gifts on her. They gift her with beauty and with happiness and with sweet speech. I think gold and pearls shall drop from her lips. I'm assuming that's a metaphor, but maybe it's not actually. Maybe that's like a literal gift of wealth and just a really inconvenient way to give it. When the girl goes home, her evil stepmother wants to know where she's been and what she's been doing. And she says, oh yes, I found this fairy house and it was tidy and I put everything into disorder, and the fairies really liked that. She lies. So the stepmother says, great, I will send my own daughter to go visit the fairy house, and then she will have all these marvelous gifts too. The stepsister follows instructions, goes to the fairy house, messes it all up, and the fairies are very upset and they curse her with the opposite of the gifts. One of the fairies says, I throw a spell over you which will render you the ugliest maid that can be found. And she was already very plain, so I can't imagine. The second one says, I bewitch you so that when you attempt to speak, all manner of filth shall fall out of your mouth. And finally, the third fairy says, I also bewitch you, and you shall become the poorest and most wretched maid in existence. And the really sad thing is that the stepsister does not seem to realize this has happened. She thinks she got the same gifts. The mistress's daughter returned home thinking she was looking quite a beauty, but when she came up close to her mother and began to speak, the mother burst out crying on seeing her own daughter so disfigured and wretched. Full of rage at the deception, she punishes the stepdaughter, she orders her to stay in the kitchen, throws her in the cinders, and calls her the Hearth-Cat, and that's where she will stay. Sometime later, the stepmother and stepsister go to festivities. These are races, and they leave first, leaving the Hearth-Cat at the fire, and then she uses her magic from the fairies, and she gets a dress, and she goes, and she's so beautiful, and the king falls in love with her, and everyone's like, who is she? We don't know, except for the stepsister, who's like, I swear to God, that's Hearth-Cat. She knows, and nobody listens to her. We repeat this, of course, 3 times. The third time, we lose a slipper on the way out of the party. The king picks up the lost slipper, and it has writing on it. It has writing on the shoe that says, this shoe shall only fit its owner. Okay. Anyway, everybody journeys to the palace to try on the slipper, including the stepsister and the stepmother in this one. At first, they keep little Hearth-Cat hidden, but the king forces them to reveal her, and they try on the slipper, and it fits. The king then arranged that she should remain in the palace and married her, and he ordered the mistress and her daughter to be put to death. The end. Okay, a lot going on there. Cinderella is a little devious in this one, and I feel really bad for the stepsister. She gets put to death along with the evil stepmother, and as far as I can tell, she only did her best. She only did what she was told. You want to hear another one? This was collected about the same time in the 1890s. This one is from Ireland, and it's called Fair, Brown, and Trembling. Once upon a time, a king had 3 daughters, and their names were Fair, Brown, and Trembling. Crazy. Fair and Brown had new dresses and went to church every Sunday. Trembling was kept at home to do the cooking and work. They would not let her go out of the house at all, for she was more beautiful than the other two, and they were in dread she might marry before themselves. And then at one point, a different king falls in love with the eldest sister. An old henwife appears and magically gives Trembling fancy clothes and a horse and all the things she needs so that she also can go to church with all the fancy people. She goes, she's a sensation, she's a hit, but nobody knows who she is. She comes home, the stepsisters are like, wow, there was a super pretty girl at church. They do this thing 3 times. The son of the king of Omania forgot all about the eldest sister and remained outside the church so as to catch the strange lady before she could hurry away. But now he's got the shoe and he says, I'm gonna marry the girl who fits this shoe. And all the other lords are like, no, we want to marry the girl who fits the shoe. All the women try on the shoe, but it won't fit any of them. And they try all sorts of tricks. Some of them stuff things in their stockings. Some of them actually try to cut off bits of their feet, but it doesn't work. None of them are the woman. Finally, the king turns up with the slipper at Trembling's home. The older sisters try it on first and it doesn't fit. And they try to keep him from finding Trembling, but love prevails. She tries on the shoe, it fits, huzzah, he proposes. The king then has to fight, has to duel all of the other potential suitors. And he defeats them all, and he gets to marry Trembling. They throw a wedding celebration that lasts a year and a day, and then they go home to the castle. And then, sometime later, Trembling has a son. That's right, there's more. As people often do, she sends for a relative to help care for her after the birth. She sends for Fair, for her eldest sister. You know, the girl that the king ditched to marry Trembling. She's like, yeah, bring her. She will help me out in my confinement. And you're not going to believe it, but that goes poorly. One day, when Trembling was well, and when her husband was away hunting, the 2 sisters went out to walk. And when they came to the seaside, the eldest pushed the youngest sister in. A great whale came and swallowed her. Fair says, great, took care of that. Goes back to the castle to pretend to be her sister. If you're getting confused at this point, it's not my fault. I'm doing a great job telling the story. The story is confusing because for this plot to work, you need to believe both that Trembling is much more beautiful than Fair, and that Trembling and Fair look similar enough that one could be mistaken for the other, even by people who know her. So when the king, her husband, comes home, he's like, oh, my wife, hello. Where is your sister that you were with? And Fair, who is in disguise as Trembling, says, oh, I'm better now, so she just went home. And the king is like, but that doesn't sound right. I'm starting to worry that you're not actually my wife. But I can't say for sure. Now, at this point, the story backtracks a little bit. We get a fun fairy tale flashback, not a thing that usually happens, and we learn that while the 2 sisters were walking around the shore before the murder happened, there was a little cowboy. Now listen, I think we both know that it's pretty likely that cowboy is a slightly misleading translation here. I bet if you read the original version of this tale, you would get the impression this was a young herder. Okay, some sort of shepherd or peasant. It's probably somebody that perfectly fits this setting. And what we're supposed to understand is that this is somebody who cares for animals, so that's why he was out there, and he happens to be young. But my translation does not say the young herder. It says the little cowboy. And that's what I choose to believe. So the little cowboy was minding his cattle nearby and saw the murder happen. And the next day, he's at the same spot and he sees the same whale come back and spit somebody up on shore. And it's Trembling. Trembling sees the little cowboy and she's like, thank God. Listen very carefully. I have something important to tell you. When you go home in the evening with the cows, tell the master that my sister Fair pushed me into the sea yesterday, that a whale swallowed me and then threw me out, but will come again and swallow me with the coming of the next tide. Then he'll go out with the tide and come again with tomorrow's tide and throw me again onto the sand. The whale will cast me out 3 times. I'm under the enchantment of this whale and cannot leave the beach or escape myself. Unless my husband saves me before I'm swallowed the 4th time, then I shall be lost. He must come and shoot the whale with a silver bullet. When he turns on the broad of his back, under the breast fin of the whale is a reddish-brown spot. My husband must hit him in that spot, for it is the only place in which he can be killed. Presumably, she learned this while within the whale. I guess inside there, you know, she's doing the Pinocchio thing, hanging out in the whale, and there's like a boss battle guide that has all this thing's stats and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So the next day, the prince gets his gun and gets his silver bullets, which he has, and goes down to the shore and waits for the whale, and the whale comes, and he does it. Trembling is saved, and she tells her husband everything that happened, and now Fair's in trouble. They send for her father, and the father's like, wow, this is really bad. I mean, however you want to punish her, I defer to you. And the prince is like, well, you know what? She's your daughter, so however you want to punish her, I defer to you. And the father says, okay, fine, I guess I'll do it. And had her put out then to sea in a barrel with provisions in it for 7 years. Yikes. And they live happily ever after. And let's do one more. You got time for one more? I want to talk about one from Russia. It's called The Wonderful Birch, and this was collected at right about the same time, the 1890s, and this was in Andrew Lang's Little Red Fairy Book, or just Red Fairy Book. I don't think they're little fairy books. I'm thinking of Little Golden Books, aren't I? Once upon a time, there was a man and a woman, and they had a daughter, and one day a witch turned the wife into a sheep, and then turned herself into the wife. So now she's pretending to be the wife. The husband is completely fooled. He thinks this witch is indeed his wife.
I'm not a witch, I'm your wife.
But the daughter is not fooled. She sees there's been a switcheroo going on, so she's very concerned. She goes to the sheep and she's like, Mom, I just overheard this imposter saying that they're gonna kill you. And the mother sheep says, don't worry about it. If they do end up killing me, please don't eat me, but do gather up my bones and bury them in a certain spot. The little girl does so, and in the place where the bones were buried, there springs up a wonderful birch tree. Some time had passed away. Who can tell how long they might have been living there? When the witch, to whom a child had been born in the meantime, began to take an ill will to the man's daughter, and to torment her in all sorts of ways. At some point, there is a festival being had at the palace, but not the little girl. She does not get a name in this one, which is frustrating to me, so I'm going to call her Cindy.
Has anyone ever called you Cindy?
Cindy wants to go to the festival, the stepmother won't let her, the tree gives her beautiful clothes, and soon little Cindy is off to the festival. And immediately, of course, the king's son is smitten with her, and he wants to sit with her the whole dinner. And if you're wondering if the other daughter has seen Cindy and recognized her, as she has in some past tales, no, she doesn't say anything. She's under the table. The witch's daughter gnawed the bones under the table. The prince did not see her, and, thinking it was a dog, he gave her such a push with his foot that her arm was broken.
And I'd kick her, sir.
Are you not sorry for the witch's daughter? It was not her fault that her mother was a witch. Cinderella runs away at the end of the night. She leaves behind a ring. Then the stepfamily gets there and are none the wiser. Lather, rinse, repeat. At the banquet the next night, the witch's daughter gnawed bones under the table, and the prince gave her a push by mistake, which broke her leg. He had never noticed her crawling about among the people's feet. She was very unlucky. That night, Cindy leaves behind her circlet. We go home, we go back. The witch's daughter is under the table again, and crouching at the people's feet, she got an eye knocked out. Poor thing. The prince has the threshold smeared with tar, and Cindy loses both of her golden slippers as she runs away. So now the prince has all of these objects. He is collecting her entire wardrobe, like infinity stones, and he says, I want to find the maiden who fits these things. So you know what? We're doing a fourth night. We're doing a fourth banquet. Everybody's coming back. The witch got ready to go too. She tied a wooden beetle on where her child's foot should have been, a log of wood instead of an arm, and stuck a bit of dirt in the empty socket for an eye, and took the child with her to the castle. When the prince gave the witch's daughter the ring, the woman filed and pared away at her daughter's finger till the ring fitted. It was the same with the circlet and the shoes of gold. She worked at her own daughter's head and feet till she got the things forced on. The prince is like, well, you got me. She fits all the stuff, so now I have to marry her. But I am very embarrassed about this whole thing. So he tries to keep it on the down low. But then finally, Cindy has a moment to make herself known and make contact with the prince, and he realizes what has happened. Thereupon, the king's son recognized the Cinder wench, so he took both the girls with him and set out to help her, right? That's why you're taking both of them? You're gonna marry Cindy, but then you're also like gonna give her poor abused sister a place to stay, right? That's why you're taking both of them? After they had gone some little way, they came to the bank of a river, and the prince threw the witch's daughter across to serve as a bridge, and so got over with the Cinder wench. There lay the witch's daughter then, like a bridge over the river, and could not stir, though her heart was consumed with grief. No help was near, so she cried at last in her anguish, May there grow a golden hemlock out of my body, perhaps my mother will know me by that token. Scarcely had she spoken when a golden hemlock sprang up from her and stood upon the bridge. But the good news is Cindy is living happily ever after. They get even more gold and riches from the birch tree, and they make their home in the palace because he's not ashamed to be seen with Cindy. She's very pretty. And have a baby. It's been a long time. When Cindy has the baby, they're like, well, we should let your mom know, like you do when you have a baby. So I don't know if Cindy has forgotten that her mom is actually a witch in disguise, or if she just never shared that detail with her husband. But they contact the witch and they're like, hey, your daughter had a baby. You're a grandma. So the witch sets out and she goes from her house to the palace and passes over a bridge and she's like, oh, look, hemlock. She goes to cut it and there's a voice and the voice is like, please don't cut me. The daughter is like, they made me a bridge and left me here. In a moment, the witch had the bridge shivered to atoms. I don't really know what that means. I think the daughter's okay. I mean, as okay as she was. So the witch takes her own daughter, into the palace with her, sneaks into Cindy's room while Cindy is sleeping, and turns her into a reindeer, and then smuggles her out of the palace. That is the order she does that. First reindeer, then quietly out of the palace, and she puts her own daughter in her place. And this fools everybody, including the prince. It does not fool the baby. The baby is very upset. The prince goes to a wise woman and he's like, why is my baby suddenly crying all the time and so upset? And the wise woman is like, because that's not your wife. She's like, just give the baby to me, okay? Your wife is a reindeer now, so let me take the baby into the woods, so she can be with her mom for a little while and then bring her back home. And she does. And it works. The baby is very comforted by the cool night air and the rustling of leaves, and then sees his mom as a reindeer and Cindy as a reindeer nurses him. And so that's what they do for a few nights. They just come out and visit and then go home, and everybody's cool. The baby is doing really well. The baby's thriving. But after a while, the prince is like, is there not any way we could get my wife back? Not that this isn't great, but what if she weren't a reindeer and were my wife instead? The wise woman says, okay, next time I go see your reindeer wife, come with me. And Cindy, as the reindeer, is like, okay, so this has to be the last time because I have to go with the herd. The herd is moving on. So I gotta go.
In fact, I have to go.
And the wise woman says, okay, let's get you all spiffy for your journey. So why don't you take your reindeer skin off and I will comb your hair. So Cindy takes her reindeer skin off, and then the wise woman combs her hair. And while this is happening, the prince comes, grabs the reindeer skin and burns it. And Cindy is like, oh my God, why would you do that? I'm naked. The prince is like, I'm taking you home. And Cindy's like, you can't, the witch is gonna eat me. And the prince is like, no, she's not. They head back to the castle. When the witch wife saw them, she ran away with her daughter. And if she has not stopped, she is running still, though at a great age. And the prince and his wife and the baby lived happily ever after. So that one was crazy. And now finally, last but not least, let's give the people what they want. Let's read the Grimm's version. I know I already said one more, and this is one more after that. It's my video. Now, to try to keep the chronology straight in our heads, the first version of Cinderella, of Ashenputtel, that was in a collection of fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm, that was published in 1813. We can definitely say this is after D'Aulnoy and Perrault are working. They are long dead. And we can also say this version was written down well before those other miscellaneous European versions that I just recounted were written down. Those were from the 1880s and the 1890s, which is going to make it really tempting to say that those are newer versions of the story, more recent versions of the story than Grimm's, but remember that is just the date they happen to be recorded. We don't know how long these stories existed in that form beforehand. So even though it looks like we've gone a little backwards, if you just look at the date on the book, these are all being developed roughly in the same century. Don't get too caught up on what came when. Once upon a time, there was a girl whose mother died. And on her deathbed, the mother told her daughter to be good. The young girl heeded the lesson to be good, and every day she visited her mother's grave and wept there. And meanwhile, her father, who was a rich man, remarried only a few months after her mother died. The woman had brought with her into the house 2 daughters who were beautiful and fair of face, but vile and black of heart. Now began a bad time for the poor stepchild. The stepsisters mock her and take away her fine clothes and force her out of her fine rooms and say she must stay in the kitchen and work for her keep and dress her in rags, and they call her Cinderella. One day their father is going away to a fair and he asks the daughters what gift he should bring back for them, and the stepsisters say they want dresses and jewels and pearls, and little Cinderella says she only wants a branch, and she plants it at the grave of her mother. 3 times a day Cinderella would visit the grave and cry and water it with her tears, and the branch grew into a strong tree where a white bird would perch, and if Cinderella would make requests of the white bird, it would answer her wishes. One day the king announced a festival. It would be 3 days, and all of the beautiful young women of the country were invited because he wanted his son to pick a bride. The stepsisters are very excited. They make all sorts of work for Cinderella with their preparations, but Cinderella is not allowed to go. After the stepsisters leave, she goes to the tree. She gets a dress of silver and gold with slippers to match and goes to the festival. Everyone's very impressed with her, and the prince is absolutely smitten and wants to dance with her all night. And rinse and repeat. She comes back the second night. They dance again. He follows her again. She scuttles up a tree. He cuts down the tree, but she's already gone. And then on the 3rd night, when the tree had provided the most magnificent gown yet and golden slippers, Cinderella tries to run away before midnight, but the prince is 1 step ahead of her, and he has poured pitch all over the stairs, and slop, that's the sound it makes when your slipper gets got by a bunch of pitch. She gets away, but not without her slipper, so now he's going to use the slipper to find her. He says, I will marry the maiden who fits this shoe. He tries it on all the women. We do the whole slipper quest thing, and he gets to the house where the stepsisters are really excited because they're like, we have really nice feet. But not nice enough. They do not fit the slipper. They are much too big, and the stepmother has a plan for that. Her mother gave her a knife and said, cut the toe off. When you are queen, you will have no more need to go on foot. The maiden cut the toe off, forced the foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. The prince says, okay, you fit the slipper, a deal's a deal, and they hop on the horse and they ride away. But as they are riding away, there's a couple of birds, there's 2 pigeons, who are narcs, who are tattletales, and they say, hey, look in the shoe. And the prince looks in the shoe and it is full of blood. So he turns that right around, goes, deposits her back at home and says, okay, time for the next one. Stepmother says just because it didn't work before is no reason to think it won't work now, and cuts the heel off of the foot of the other stepsister. And then the pigeons are like, the blood, dude, the blood. And he checks again and he's like, oh, I did it again. This is also not the right one, said he. Have you no other daughter? No, said the man. There is still a little stunted kitchen wench, which my late wife left behind her, but she cannot possibly be the bride. They try to keep the prince from seeing her, but he insists, and finally, he tries the slipper on Cinderella, and it fits with no knife needed. The stepmother and the 2 sisters were horrified and became pale with rage. He, however, took Cinderella on his horse and rode away with her. That is how the original 1813 Brothers Grimm Cinderella ends. Cinderella lives happily ever after, and her stepmother and stepsisters, who both now have very mutilated feet, they're just like sad. You notice how nobody had their eyes pecked out? This is why it's so annoying when people are like, actually, in the original Cinderella, did you know that they have their eyes pecked out? Because putting aside everything we've talked about how there is no original, and even putting aside the fact that Perrault's Cinderella was published over 100 years before the Brothers Grimm version that people want to say is older because it's gorier, I guess. It's not even in the original Brothers Grimm story. It's in a later revision of the Brothers Grimm version. By the 1830s, we have this ending. On the day that the wedding with the prince was to take place, the 2 false sisters came to ingratiate themselves and to share in Cinderella's good fortune. When the bridal couple set out for the church, the oldest sister was on the right, the younger on the left. Suddenly, the pigeons appeared and pecked out 1 eye from each of them. And as they came back from the church later on, the oldest was on the left and the youngest on the right. The pigeons appeared and pecked out the other eye from each sister. Thus they were punished with blindness for the rest of their lives due to their wickedness and malice. So the presence of the stepsisters is incredibly consistent, but there is so much variation in these characters. I mean, to begin with, they're not always stepsisters. In plenty of versions that are recognizable as Cinderella, they are biological sisters. And some of them are in kind of a gray area, like if a witch is in disguise as your mother, and presumably like fully has your mom's body and genetics, and then has a baby with your father, is that your half sibling or is that just like your full sibling? And it's interesting that they are the same figure playing a similar role in the story, but they can have polar opposite qualities and descriptions. Like in some of them, they are very beautiful. Think about the Grimm's version, beautiful of face, but vile and black of heart. But in some of them, they are explicitly described as ugly. There's a version from Scotland that calls them the ugly lassie and the pretty lassie. And often that is introduced in a way that is linked to their poor character. Like in Katie Woodencloak, which is a version from Norway, also collected in the late 1800s. There was one daughter, Cinderella, who was so clever and lovely. There wasn't a cleverer or lovelier princess in all the world. And then the father remarries a widow, and she too had an only daughter. But this daughter was just as bad and ugly as the other was kind, clever, and lovely. And then there are times when the ugliness is part of the storyline, and we see this character be cursed with ugliness. So think about Hearth-Cat. She starts out plain and then gets supernaturally ugly. There's a version called The Little Rag Girl from Georgia.
Capital City Tbilisi and former member of the Soviet Union. And we kindly request y'all mind your P's and Q's.
And it has that same plot point where the stepsister is punished and cursed with ugliness. But here it's like a demonic ugliness that is communicated in like a racialized way. When she looked at herself, she was black as an African, and on her head there was a horn. She cut it off again and again, but it grew larger and larger. If the stepsisters have their appearance described at all, it is probably going to be at one of those two extremes, which is kind of what you expect from fairy tales. They are very sparing with description, so if they're going to tell you about something, it's going to be because it's so extraordinary. But whether they are ugly or beautiful, if the stepsisters' appearance is important, it's going to be in a way that is like intense and offensive to the reader. But a lot of the time, we don't really get a description for the stepsisters. I mean, I think of them as the ugly stepsisters, as that being the archetype, but more often than not, we don't really hear what they look like. We just hear that they are jealous of how beautiful and beloved Cinderella is. If you go back to Xian, or if you look at Perrault, the most popular version now, they never say that they're really ugly. They just say that Cinderella's really pretty and they hate her. There's also a fair amount of variation in how they are treating Cinderella. I mean, they're always treating her badly, but sometimes they are like her primary abuser. They are the ones who are taking action to make her life miserable. Whereas in other stories, they're just kind of there. They are benefiting from the stepmother's preference, but they are not the ones taking it upon themselves to enforce this hierarchy. If they're doing something to Cinderella, it's more because they are a pawn of the stepmothers. They are a tool in her game. The stories also have a lot of variation in how the story ends for the stepsisters. You might think there would be a strong correlation there. Like, the worse the stepsisters behave, the worse their punishment is. But that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be a little more random and capricious than that. Sometimes the stepsisters and the stepmother just don't get what they wanted and they end up like sad. They get what they deserve and have to live with each other, making each other miserable forever. Or maybe they have learned their lesson and now sadly go about their sad lives a little wiser. I was surprised to find a fair number of versions where they are completely forgotten about. Like the stepsisters matter in the beginning of the story, but then are just lost somewhere in the middle. But in plenty of these stories, the stepsisters are horrifyingly punished. There are a lot of variations where there's some aspect of foot mutilation, so they have been physically altered and harmed forever by the events of the story. And then often on top of the foot mutilation, they are either killed or imprisoned or somehow face terrible consequences. It's very uncommon for them to have any ending that isn't unhappy, at the very least. But it does happen, specifically in Perrault. In the Perrault version, Cinderella specifically forgives them. She extends love and forgiveness and brings her stepsisters with her into her new life and marries them off to lords. I wouldn't say Perrault's is the only version where this happens. This is what Maria Tatar says. Perrault's ending was the exception rather than the rule. Other printed versions of Cinderella, including French ones, show the stepsisters and their mother enduring agonizing mental or physical pain. The judgmental posture of the narrator derives, to some extent, from the need to provide a moral backbone to what otherwise might be perceived as an utterly frivolous tale. This is another good reason to resist the allure of the original, because people will try to tell you not only about the original plot, but about the original meaning. This fairy tale was originally meant to teach XYZ. But Cinderella is a great example of how flexible these stories are as far as meaning, moral, and message. Today, we often think of fairy tales as being very didactic, as being these little lessons meant specifically for children, and that was often a role they played, but that's not necessarily their original role. These older folk tales were often for a more general audience. Some of them were for specifically an adult audience. When you see a fairy tale that feels very lesson-y, maybe sometimes that was created by somebody who wanted to teach a lesson, but usually not. Usually it was a story that already existed, that felt kind of random and fantastical and scary, and a particular storyteller, a reteller, took it and infused it with a particular message.
A lot of those older stories specifically don't have morals.
Yeah.
Like the morals get updated later where it's like, and because you believed and you gave him a kiss, you are rewarded for your faith and trust, and now he is a handsome prince. But a lot of older stories are like, yeah, she got frustrated and tried to kill this frog, and
and then he was just
a prince, and they got over that really quickly.
These morals were often added on after the fact, so sometimes they don't make a lot of sense if you actually look at the story. And sometimes you can see stories with multiple morals that seem very different. It seems to me very likely that stories with this kind of flexibility that can lend themselves to different messages that suit different cultures at different times, different motivations for different audiences, the more stories can handle that variation, the more likely they are to survive. The fact that Cinderella has survived so long and keeps getting retold over and over would seem to me to be a testament, in part, to how flexible it is at conveying message. Now, in every version, Cinderella is always beautiful, and she's always valued and rewarded for that beauty. But what that beauty is also very, very flexible. Several versions emphasize that when Cinderella is thrown from her luxury into a life of work, and she doesn't have enough food and she's working very hard, she gets thinner, which makes her less attractive. In fact, this is explicitly part of the stepmother's plan, that if she doesn't have access to rich food and she is physically exerting herself, she won't be curvy anymore, which will make her unattractive. If we go back to Katie Woodencloak, at one point there is a magical bull that helps her out and, among other things, gives her food. She soon got up her flesh again and grew so plump and rosy and white that the queen and her scrawny chip of a daughter turned blue and yellow for spite. This beauty standard, where both thinness and muscles are considered unattractive, it isn't just a detail in the story, it's like woven into the fabric of the story. It's part of why the characters make the decisions that they do. So it's almost hard to imagine how you could tell this story with different beauty standards. But people do, and it's seamless. You look at somebody like Perrault, who's writing in a culture where tiny waists are prioritized, then that suddenly becomes core to the story. There's all this business about laces and ribbons to squeeze the stepsisters down into smaller dresses. In fact, the whole business with the slipper should be completely incomprehensible outside of a cultural context where tiny feet are specifically prized. It makes sense in Xian, but would it make sense outside of that context? Apparently, yes. Apparently, we just accept it. Somehow, the same story can be about how beauty equals goodness and about how beauty does not equal goodness with the same story because of the flexibility of these characters, because of the fact that you have an example in the form of Cinderella and you have your counterexample in the form of the stepsisters. But for that to work, of course, Cinderella and the sisters, however many there are, whether they are sisters or stepsisters, they have to be clear foils. This setup and fairy tales in general doesn't have a lot of room for gray, for nuance. So in this oral tradition and in these literary fairy tales, you don't really have room for the figure of a good stepsister. but you can see the desire is there. They're laying the groundwork. There's a twinkle of the concept of a good stepsister, of complicating this archetype. Let's see what happens to the stepsisters when we jump to the big screen and the stage and commercial culture. In the 20th century, something super fun and funky happens, which is that fairy tales, which are like the language of our soul, also became commercial products. These storytelling traditions that stretch back centuries conservatively, millennia probably, have now become entwined with commercial culture and capital I intellectual property. And that has foundationally changed them in ways that we cannot even begin to conceptualize right now, and I'm certainly not going to be able to encapsulate in this video. But if we keep our focus and look at what happened to Cinderella's stepsisters, we can get through this. So fairy tales enter the world of commerce first through books, okay? You can literally produce and sell a written and bound collection of fairy tales. This is one of those big inflection points that leads to us thinking of fairy tales as being for children specifically. These stories are being collected in a child-safe form, whatever that meant to the author at the time, and sold in a volume of books for children. And if we look at a lot of the European and American market, fairy tales are becoming known as stories for children at the same time that people are becoming more and more strict about stories for children being instructive. People have always used stories to teach children, but they have not always felt that every single story told to children needs to be a lesson, or that that lesson needs to fit within a very narrow scope of moral instruction. For many of the authors and publishers and gatekeepers in the growing publishing industry, it wasn't enough for fairy tales to just reflect something true about the world. They had to have an easily stated moral that told children to be quiet, to listen to their parents, or, I mean, a lot of it was to be quiet, to be a good child, which to many of these writers meant, above all, being docile and biddable. Maria Totter calls this a wave of moralism that swept through children's literature in the 18th and 19th centuries. Once fairy tales entered the realm of children's literature, they took on a protective didactic coloring that has been virtually impossible to remove. If you're trying to instruct someone, you want to have a good example for them to follow and to reward in the story, but that makes telling entertaining stories very difficult because goodness is boring. For a story, you need conflict, and for an exciting, memorable story, you need transgression. So it's actually more important for your story to have a counterexample where you can display the bad behavior and then punish it. So now that Cinderella is part of commercial culture, or I guess now that commercial culture is part of Cinderella, you start seeing a really consistent pattern for the stepsisters. There's nearly always two. They're like the Sith now, they come in pairs. Even though you could do the job with just one, and plenty of the folk tales have just one, there's something so fun about a pair, right? Especially in a visual medium. The stepsisters start being relied on as comic relief, and so the two of them can argue and snipe at each other, and they can make faces and have overlapping dialogue, and you can have great fun with their costumes. And they're funny. They work well as comic relief, so they become more and more ridiculous, which means they get less and less intimidating as villains. Their sins become less about cruelty and more about poor taste. You start to see fewer and fewer of those beautiful but cruel stepsisters and more of those ugly and mean but in kind of a vapid, dumb way. They are ridiculous and beloved as comic villains, but they're never characters you're supposed to root for. They are firmly on that side of the fence. You're still supposed to feel that they don't deserve to end up happy the way that Cinderella does. When they have eyes for the prince, you're supposed to know that that's ridiculous. We largely get rid of the gory punishment, the physical mutilation. We get punishments that are more silly and poetically just, but they are still punished. It's still supposed to be satisfying that they get what they deserve, which is some level of unhappiness. And yet, the reason that they deserve it, the thing that disqualifies them from fulfillment and romance and the happily ever after, is starting to become really vague. They're mean, usually. They're like rude to Cinderella. They're vain and greedy and stuck up. But these are like character flaws that a person could conceivably work on. Because nobody's perfect. These aren't like grievous sins and deep harms they have done their fellow man. And they're so young, and they've had this horrible mother who hasn't taught them any better. It's hard not to wonder why it's so ridiculous for them to dream of the prince. I've been pondering this and trying to find the words for it, to name this ridiculousness that there is about the stepsisters in so many of these film versions that disqualifies them from the happily ever after. It's something more than the sum of its parts. It's not just physical unattractiveness. It's not just unpleasantness or lack of decorum. It's a sense that they are doing womanhood wrong. Cinderella is being a woman properly, in a way that the stepsisters are being a woman incorrectly. Some representations about the stepsisters are very literal about this. They give what we consider mannish or masculine attributes to the stepsisters. Or you have British pantomime tradition, where the stepsisters are traditionally played by men in drag.
Oh, if we're not beautiful and gorgeous, then what are we?
In many of these versions, for all their primping and vanity, there's something about their femininity that's supposed to feel off to the audience. You're not supposed to buy their femininity. There are other versions where you don't see this masculinizing aspect, but you do see their childishness being emphasized. They're really infantilized. They're not adults, and you do need to be an adult to be a woman, theoretically. Cinderella has self-control.
Above all, self-control.
And discipline. She is in command of her emotions. She thinks long-term. She has higher-order thinking. While the stepsisters, in many versions, are perpetual children. They have tantrums. They follow their whims and their immediate desires. They can't understand a metaphor or more nuanced adult conversation. They want to marry the prince in a way that a child imagines having a wedding, being a bride, acquiring a husband. There are good stepsisters now. There are stepsisters out here finding love and getting married and being supportive to Cinderella. What is going on? I wanted to find out why there are sometimes good stepsisters now, but it turns out the question to actually ask is, why were there suddenly good stepsisters between 20 and 30 years ago? Because here's the thing that's crazy. It all happened at once. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I've seen a good number of examples of some sort of good stepsister happening. And as I started to put some notes together, as I got out my red string and started making the connections, it quickly became clear that these emerged almost simultaneously, which is so exciting. I mean, that means we're onto something, right? Like 2 people having the same idea at the same time? Like, sure, plausible. 3 people? Yeah, maybe. 4 people stretch. 5 people? Absolutely not. There's something in the water. And there was something in the water. For a 10-year span from 1997 to 2007, we had what I like to call the Y2K Stepsister Revolution. All at the same time. Everybody was making good stepsisters. Now, to be fair, it's not just about stepsisters, because this is a time when everybody wanted to be subverting and remixing fairy tales. I looked at this 10-year period and called it vaguely Y2K because it spans the turn of the millennium, but you know what else is right in the middle of this period? Shrek. Everybody wants a turn, bringing their hip 90s sarcasm to widely beloved public domain characters. The culture is very ready for this, because if you want to do a remix, if you want to do a little subversion, then you need a really strong foundation of like monoculture to push against. And Disney was giving monoculture. The Disney Renaissance is in full swing. We are getting these 2D musicals, specifically of a lot of fairy tales, especially princess fairy tales. The Disney Renaissance is built on princesses. Technically, this 10-year period begins before the launch of the Disney Princess brand, but the concept is in the works. The idea of a Disney princess is still a thing everybody knows, and Disney is selling products under the heading The Disney Princess Collection. This single version of all these classic fairy tales, whichever version Disney happened to run, has reached such saturation in the market that you can count on everybody to know it, and so you can have a little fun. You can get in there and play with the sandbox. And everybody's favorite sandbox is Cinderella. By this point, Cinderella had become kind of a metonym for fairy tale princess, or just kind of fairy tale story in general.
Cinderella's on her bedroom floor.
So anytime you mess with Cinderella, you get instant brand recognition, you get some street cred for messing with a classic, and you have like 5 different female characters that you can mess around with. You've got Cinderella and the Wicked Stepmother, and you can count the Stepsisters as one, and the Fairy Godmother. The sandbox is ready, all the little toys are scattered about. Got your little shovels, got those little buckets where you can make a sand castle, which is cheating. Let's talk about some Stepsisters. In 1997, we have 2 really significant works that are offering a fresh, modern spin on Cinderella, and neither of them use the F word in their marketing, but I would describe them as feminist revisitations. One is the TV movie remake of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, starring Brandy and Whitney Houston. This was actually the 3rd time around for this musical written for TV. The 1997 version was longer than the previous 2 versions, so they were able to add a couple scenes, and they went back and found some older, more obscure songs from Rodgers and Hammerstein's discography and brought them into Cinderella. They also went in and refreshed or rewrote a lot of the dialogue. One of the things the 97 version is most remembered and most referenced for is the extremely diverse casting. In keeping with the spirit of a Cinderella for the 90s, the producers very deliberately sought out actors with a range of ethnicities. The world in this movie appears to be colorblind almost to the point of absurdity. Not only do individuals in the same family not resemble each other at all, when the prince sets out to find the woman he danced with at the ball, he tries the slipper on everybody, irrespective of race. This kind of casting is often called colorblind casting, but it's worth noting that you can't achieve this result by not paying any attention to appearance or ethnicity at all. For example, if you've cast Bernadette Peters to play the stepmother and Brandy to play Cinderella, you're in some tricky territory. Cinderella can be underappreciated and undervalued, but the visual of her being physically harmed or verbally abused by her stepfamily is so volatile that they decided to avoid it as much as possible. She is dressed in servants' clothes and has to work, but we do not see her dirty or physically harmed or looking unwell. She is a hard-working dreamer who is emotionally neglected. The stepmother's cruelty is not vicious or pointed, it's sort of jaded. So when it comes to the stepsisters, they honestly barely interact with Cinderella at all. In the opening scene, they badger her to say who looks better in a hat, and then when she says honestly that they both look pretty silly, they dismiss her as having bad taste.
What did you ask her for? She doesn't know anything about hats, she said so herself.
But that's basically as bad as it gets. Like, they're mean to her, but they're also mean to each other. When Cinderella dances with the prince at the ball, they are jealous of her. They give a fantastic rendition of the fabulous Stepsister song,
Why can a fellow ever once prefer a usual girl like me?
Because why would a fellow want a girl like that? I'm always saying this. As with the 2 other versions of the TV movie, they are very similar in personality, but they have separate quirks. They both have something distinct about their personalities or presentation that makes them, of course, unattractive. But what's notable about this one is that they look very different. In almost all the film versions I've looked at prior to the 1990s, the stepsisters are, if not identical, then at least of the same general build, height, appearance. But when you have a duo of characters that work together as comic relief, it's very common to have them look very different. In fact, the classic version is one tall and skinny, one short and fat. If you look at the 1950 Disney animated Cinderella, you see 2 different iterations of this. This is actually one of the few takes on the stepsisters that takes that approach. Not only are these actors different ethnicities, but they are different in stature. Also in 1997, in April, we have a very important book, Gail Carson Levine's Ella Enchanted. This is a middle grade novel that uses the fairy tale of Cinderella as a jumping off point to tell this really cool fantasy adventure. Now, Ella Enchanted was very popular and was made into a movie in 2004, starring Anne Hathaway and Hugh Dancy, and anybody who loved the book will tell you all day about how very, very different the book and the movie are, and they are very different, but not really when it comes to the stepsisters. The stepsisters are largely the same, so when I tell you about this book, I'm gonna use clips from the movie. I'm sorry. Young Ella Ephraim has a dead mother. Her father remarries this terrible lady, Dame Olga. Dame Olga already has 2 daughters. They are called Hattie and Olive. Now, Ella Ephraim has bigger problems, of course. She has a curse, supposedly a gift of obedience given to her at birth by a fairy. This makes her incredibly vulnerable, and in fact, on her deathbed, Ella's mother makes her promise to never tell anybody about the curse. But if you hang out with Ella for long enough, you're gonna realize pretty quickly there's something wrong with her.
Freeze!
And Hattie figures it out. Hattie is the older of the stepsisters. She is much smarter. She is more cruel and unpleasant, and she is prettier. Olive is the younger stepsister, and she is less unpleasant. She's still unpleasant, okay? She's still kind of a jerk, but she doesn't go out of her way to be cruel to Ella the way that Hattie does. She is also seen as being less attractive and much, much less bright.
Olive, have you noticed anything strange about Ella?
No, not really.
Have you noticed it gets darker at night?
That's because of Ella.
Never mind.
In the movie, both stepsisters seem kind of dim, but like Olive especially. Hattie has just enough brains to be able to put together the very obvious clues to learn what's going on with Ella. In the book, the gap is a lot more pronounced. Hattie seems to be actually intelligent, whereas Olive probably has some sort of cognitive or developmental disability. The 3 girls are all of a similar age. Olive's not a baby, but she can like barely write. Multiple times she is called a simpleton, which might be the characters just insulting her for not being very bright, or might be an acknowledgement that she is in some way impaired. She is also very food motivated and specifically loves cake. In both the book and the movie, Hattie is instrumental in reducing Ella to a servant in her own house. So for our purposes here, Ella Enchanted is really significant for the way it shifts the oppression of the family onto just one stepsister and lets the other one off easy. She's not the nicest person, but you're kind of amused by her. You kind of feel bad for her.
In time, Hattie became reconciled to our marriage and used her connection to us to her best advantage. She never married, but Olive did. A garrulous widower fell in love with her unwavering attention. When she'd demand he talk to her, he'd tell her about his triumphs, his enemies, his opinions on everything. She wasn't anxious to wed. In exchange for her consent, he paid her 20 kjs every day and served a white cake with every meal.
The following year, in 1998, we get the first appearance in a feature film of a proper good stepsister. It would be really foolish for me to claim that this is the first. This is the first character of this type in any sort of storytelling, in any sort of literature. I'd be asking to be disproven if I made such a definitive statement, but what I will say is I have looked. I have tried really hard to find an earlier example of what I consider to be a good stepsister character. We've seen examples of stepsisters that are less and less mean. They might even verge on harmless. Some of them are very silly. Some of them are pitiable. You kind of feel bad for them. But in 1998, with the movie Ever After, starring Drew Barrymore, this is the first time we get what I consider to be the good stepsister character. But as soon as we get one, we get a bunch. Ever After is a retelling of the Cinderella fairy tale as though it is historical fiction. So the magic and supernatural elements have been scrubbed and replaced by the intervention of mortal characters and like the wonders of science and Cinderella's own inner strength. The movie actually begins with a framing device that shows us the way this story is responding to more familiar fairy tale versions, specifically the Perrault version. The Brothers Grimm have been summoned to an audience with a lady. She's just credited as the Grande Dame. She's got a castle and she's very fancy, and she has brought them there to hear her story. The Grande Dame claims to be a descendant of Cinderella, that the story of Cinderella actually happened many years ago, but it has been clouded by myth. They've added on all those magical details that have obscured the real story. So here's the real story.
What is that phrase you use? Oh yes, once upon a time.
We've been 2 peas in a pod, you and I, for a long time.
Baroness Rothmila de Ghent and her daughters, Marguerite and Jacqueline.
Hello, Danielle.
Mademoiselle. Utopia.
It means paradise.
I shall be back in a week.
The older sister, Marguerite, has followed in her mother's footsteps, becoming cruel and cold and vain. She's determined to make a good match, and it seems likely that she will. She's considered very beautiful. Jacqueline, the younger sister, is agreed by all to be less beautiful. She doesn't have the refinement or the vanity, and she just likes food too much. She really gets dumped on by her mother and sister, but certainly has it better than Danielle. And in fact, she's very aware that the bullying she experiences is not the worst case scenario. It could get worse.
Are you lazy little leech?
Jacqueline, go and boil some water.
Me? Boil water? Oh, I knew it. I just knew it.
She's worried about her own status and, in some ways, seems to buy into the hierarchy of the family. But she doesn't have that same heart for cruelty. She likes Danielle fine, and as she now comes of age, she's getting uncomfortable with the whole setup. Going with the program, letting Danielle be abused this way in exchange to keep her own precarious position, it doesn't feel worth it anymore. One day, Danielle just snaps. For years and years, Danielle has taken it. She has tried and tried to please her stepmother. But watching her stepmother disrespect and dismantle her family home has become too much. And Danielle's had this secret romance with the prince. She's experiencing again what it's like to be loved and valued. She's starting to remember who she is. And maybe she can't live like this anymore.
These are my mother's. Yes, and she's dead.
Danielle gets in a very satisfying punch in the eye, and we have a little fun as they run around the house. But very quickly, we stop having fun. We see the worst scene in the whole movie. Marguerite threatens to burn Danielle's most prized possession. Danielle gives in and returns her mother's shoes, and Marguerite burns the book anyway. And in this moment, as Danielle screams out, you can see something deep inside Jacqueline breaks. Something in her world, in the way she understands her family and herself, is never the same. She helps patch Danielle up after Danielle is whipped for her little display, and she tries to rationalize how this could all possibly be okay. I mean, maybe Danielle just needs to do what she's told, like Jacqueline does.
You really brought this upon yourself, you know. I don't know what's come over me. She should not have said that about your mother.
Jacqueline hates how Danielle is treated, but she feels powerless to stand up to her mother. Something's gotta give. Radmilla has Danielle captured and sold to a neighboring villain. You know how you've got neighbors who are just like vaudeville villains? Danielle is imprisoned there, and she's a self-rescuing princess, so she frees herself, but meanwhile, the prince is trying to find her. And Jacqueline is able to point him in the right direction and make sure that Danielle is saved, and then helps to coordinate the comeuppance of Radmilla and Marguerite. And in the end, she is saved from the punishment that befalls the rest of the Step family.
I will forget you after this moment and never think of you again.
Now get to work!
She gets to stay friends with Danielle and even has a lovely romance with one of the prince's buddies. And so she gets her own little happily ever after. The film was pitched to audiences as a fresh and updated take on Cinderella. This was a fairy tale for the 1990s. Critics at the time basically accepted that framing. In the LA Times review, in this revisionist version, the stepsisters are beautiful, not ugly, even though Megan Dodds as Marguerite, the prettier of the pair, possesses an inner child of incomparable nastiness. A very similar take in the Chicago Tribune review. The stepsisters, usually ugly, have here had a makeover. They're a pair of beauties, one bad, Megan Dodds as Marguerite, and one good, Melanie Lynskey's Jacqueline. And even now that we are decades past the initial marketing for this movie, this tends to still be the way people talk about Ever After. This is from a Mary Sue article that's reviewing the film in 2019. The Baroness and Marguerite are delightful villainous figures who are depicted more as cruel schemers than the typical ugly stepfamily dynamic. These statements make total sense if your only context for the story of Cinderella is the Disney version, but they don't make any sense in the broader history of Cinderella as a story. The idea that the stepsisters are comic relief, that they don't have a lot of power in the story, they're mostly there to be ridiculous, and they are very ugly, that's a much newer version of the stepsisters than the cruel and beautiful version. If you're looking just at Marguerite, arguably Ever After is offering a more classic, fairy tale-based version of the stepsisters than Disney's. Now, something very interesting that you might have noticed in those quotes. The reviewers I referenced do not seem to agree about the beauty of the stepsisters, or about one of the stepsisters. Everybody agrees that Marguerite is very beautiful, but they don't quite agree about Jacqueline. I kept noticing this across all the reviews I read of this movie, that there are very different accounts of the beauty of Jacqueline. Some reviewers say that both the stepsisters are beautiful. A lot of them call Marguerite the prettier one, but some of them just say she's the pretty one, that Jacqueline is not supposed to be pretty. An important distinction here is that we're talking about the beauty of the character and not the actor. Obviously, whether you find one actor prettier than another is very subjective, but I'm talking about the character description. When these critics are summarizing the story, when they describe these characters, is Jacqueline a beautiful character or not? Theoretically, that's a basic fact about a character that basically everybody in the audience should be on the same page about. It's weird to have so much disagreement. How do you tell a story about a character that is ugly through a medium that is unable or unwilling to represent ugliness? As it turns out, that's kind of hard. The year after Ever After, in 1999, we get another important entry into the canon of Y2K Stepsisters. This is the novel Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister by Gregory Maguire, who you might know best as the author of Wicked, and in this book, he's essentially giving the stepsisters the Wicked treatment. We know them as villains in a classic story, and now they're taking center stage as protagonists, where we hear a version of the story that's more sympathetic to them. Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister is about the unbearable horror of being perceived. Like we just saw in Ever After, Maguire is taking a historical fiction approach to the story of Cinderella, and he has decided to set the story during the tulip craze in 17th century Holland. This is a world full of people who make their living dealing in beauty. Merchants who deal in tulips, painters who capture beauty in paintings, or create beauty if there wasn't any to begin with, and women who earn their keep by bringing beauty into a man's home. This is a tough place to try to make your way if you are both female and ugly. And in this version, the stepsisters are both referred to as ugly, but in very different ways.
Iris has a sudden notion of how she and her family must look as stolid Englishers in this European otherworld. The spiky mother, Margrethe, tugging at her gigantic firstborn. Ruth, heaving her lungs like a bellows working up to a whale. And Iris herself, gaunt and unlovely as a hermit, shrinking into herself as best she can.
Ruth is the older sister. She is introduced as a solid thing, already more than adult size, but simple. Ruth is tall with wide shoulders. She's often compared to an ox or a bull, and her movements are described as lunging and lumbering. Iris says she is mostly mute. Her tongue is twisted at the back where it connects with her mind. I've seen many other readers theorize about what this description means to them, that to them it sounds like autism, it sounds like Down syndrome. I looked to see if Gregory Maguire has ever spoken about writing Ruth, and I couldn't find any statements from him that give me clarity. So I'm pretty comfortable describing this character as disabled, but not anything more specific than that. The younger sister, on the other hand, is called Iris, and she is the primary point of view character. Iris is what you might call plain. She has ordinary features, and her ugliness is more about missing beauty than it is about having something about her that people consider ugly. Margrethe, the mother, insists that Iris is painfully plain, and Iris feels that way.
I don't know how to improve my lot unless it's to take a heavy Spanish veil and hide my ugly face from the good citizens of Harlem, says Iris. The master replies, self-mockery is an uglier thing than any human face, Iris. No one can pretend you are a pretty wench, but you are smart and you are kind. Don't betray those impulses in yourself.
The Cinderella character in the story is called Clara, and she's a weird kid. She's a real weird kid, but very beautiful. She's got a bunch of trauma from being kidnapped as a child and being hidden away by her mother, and she thinks she'll be kidnapped again at any minute, and also, like, low-key thinks she's a changeling. She's very aware that she's beautiful, but she thinks of it as a burden, or at the very least, she talks about it being a burden. She reminds me of those girls on Instagram that talk about the dark side of pretty privilege.
Oh, says Clara. Mercy, there's nothing monstrously ugly about you. Ruth may be unpleasing, but you are merely plain. If anything, it's my beauty that's monstrous, for it sweeps away any other aspect of my character.
When we meet this Fisher family, they're in a really bad situation. They've basically fled England and now need to find stability for themselves in Holland. They find work for a time helping a master painter, and Iris actually sits for a portrait. This painter is also a real weird dude. He is interested in beauty and ugliness, and in fact we learn he spent a lot of his time painting trying to capture ugliness. Iris assists him and starts to train under him, and he eventually shows her a hall of paintings that he calls the Gallery of God's Mistakes.
The master pulls the tattered end of a curtain covering a high window. Light rushes into the mildewy space. Faces blink or seem to. They come into the light again, reluctant, grimacing, pathetic, and beastly. I think of them as friends, says the master, for aren't we all this bruised? A child with the face of a parrot, another dwarf, and a third, a whole family series of them. There's the girl boy of Rotterdam, painted nude, all its disgusting punishment in view. A dog with a goiter that looks like a loaf of bread. A pair of siblings who sit so near that only one skin is needed to cover them both.
This book does feel like it's mostly about paintings, but I promise we do get the Cinderella stuff. So Clara's mother does die, and then Iris and Ruth's mother marries Clara's father. He is a wealthy tulip merchant for a time. He loses everything when the tulip market crashes. The prince shows up at the door with a shoe. He's looking for the mystery maiden he danced with at the ball. He tries the slipper on Iris, no fit. He tries it on Ruth, no fit, but he does notice something odd. Ruth's fingers are burned. A lot of stuff has been Ruth the whole time. It looks for a minute like Ruth is going to be in enormous trouble and that maybe the whole family is going to be arrested, but when Clara is recognized as the Cinderella princess from the ball, she asks that they all be forgiven.
Her hand goes up to block the prince's accusatory finger from Ruth's cowering form. Clara's is a gesture of charity, the only beauty that has consequence. Shield my family from harm, she says, and let everything else follow as it may.
So everybody lives as happy as can be expected ever after. And in the epilogue, it is revealed to the reader that even though Iris was the main point of view central character in the novel, we are led to believe that the person telling the story, the person recalling the events and transmitting them to the reader, was actually Ruth.
No, I wasn't evil, but I was jealous of everything. Clara's incredible countenance, Iris's talent, Caspar's attentions to them both. Iris never saw that in some ways I belonged in the gallery of God's mistakes.
And, the end. In 2002, Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister was adapted for a TV movie for, once again, the wonderful world of Disney. I had no idea this movie existed until researching for this video, but it's got some names in there. It's got Stockard Channing, it's got Jonathan Pryce, and Matthew Good. Now, before I show you Iris, keep in mind how Iris is described in the book. Her mother calls her painfully plain, and Iris thinks of herself as ugly, but there are some different opinions. Other characters don't seem to call her pretty, but they don't think she's as horrifically ugly as Margareta suggests.
Allow me to introduce Iris and Ruth Fisher. They've come from England.
Iris is played by Azura Skye, and if you know her from something but can't quite place it, it's probably because she was in 2 episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The movie is very different from the novel. You still have the same basic plot points with the painting and the ball and everything, but the movie is a lot less weird and unsettling. The master painter is less weird. We don't do the whole Gallery of God's Mistakes thing. And Ruth's characterization is also a lot less extreme. You don't have her constantly hitting things and knocking things over, vocalizing wildly. In the movie, Ruth speaks quite a lot. We don't have the twist here that Ruth has a lot more going on than initially meets the eye. The whole thing feels much safer and friendlier and ends on a happier note. The ending of the book is, I guess, bittersweet. Things end as well as you could expect, but people don't live long, gloriously happy lives. The movie doesn't have the framing device that shows Ruth as an old woman, so we basically end when everybody has coupled up and declares that they shall live happily ever after. And the movie also has a different perspective on beauty. In the movie, Iris's biggest problem is her low self-esteem. She could be beautiful if she just believed in herself.
I see a mother who would let her daughter believe she's not pretty enough to be noticed by men. Everyone is still eyeing you.
Surely not.
Do you choose to be so naive that you can't see that you have some cachet of your own?
Moving on to 2001, time for another book. The Bridgerton series by Julia Quinn was published from 2000 to 2006. Each book is a self-contained romance novel following one of the children of the illustrious Bridgerton family in high society in Regency, England. The third book is called An Offer from a Gentleman, and it's a Cinderella retelling, in the vein of Charles Perrault. Our prince is second son Benedict Bridgerton, and our Cinderella is Sophie Beckett, who is the illegitimate daughter of an earl. So the family tree looks like this. It's basically what we're accustomed to true, but there never was a marriage between Sophie's mother and the Earl. Sophie's mother passes away before the book begins. She was a maid in the Earl's household. Sophie doesn't have the status or privileges that she would have if she were legitimate, but she is raised in comfort and she is educated and she's well cared for by the staff. When Sophie is about 11, her father, the Earl, marries a widow. This is Araminta Gunningworth, the Countess of Penwood, and she comes with 2 daughters, Rosamond and Posy, who are near Sophie's age. Sophie is very hopeful that these 2 little girls are new friends, and one of them does seem friendly.
The smaller one smiled back, but the older one, whose hair was the color of spun gold, took her cue from her mother, pointed her nose in the air, and looked firmly away. "This," the Countess said, "is Rosamond. She is 11. And this," she then motioned to the other girl, who had not taken her eyes off of her shoes, "is Posy. She is 10. Sophie looked at Posy with great interest. Unlike her mother and sister, her hair and eyes were quite dark, and her cheeks were a bit pudgy.
Araminta hates Sophie from the get-go. She obviously knows who Sophie is, and she is not pleased that her daughters have to share space with an illegitimate child.
Rosamond and Posy took their cues from Araminta and treated Sophie with hostility and disdain, although Posy's heart clearly wasn't into torture and cruelty the way Rosamond's was. Posy showed her the occasional kindness, although more often than not she just sighed and said, "My mummy says I'm not to be nice to you."
When the Earl dies, Araminta no longer has to restrain her hatred and can openly abuse Sophie. She does keep Sophie around. She keeps her in the house because of a provision in the Earl's will that Araminta is entitled to a much larger allowance if she supports Sophie until adulthood. But she supports her in the bare minimum fashion possible. She keeps her fed and clothed, and she has her earn her keep as a servant in the household. But there's actually an additional provision in the will that Araminta lies about. She keeps it secret that when Sophie reaches adulthood, she's entitled to a dowry to support her in marriage. Araminta hides this from everybody and embezzles the funds. When we catch up with the family years later, Rosamond and Posy and Sophie have a similar dynamic as adults that they did as children.
She'd once hoped that Rosamond and Posy would be her sisters, but that had never come to pass. Posy might have tried, but Araminta wouldn't allow it, and Posy, for all her sweetness, had never been strong enough to stand up to her mother.
There's a nice little callback to the Perrault fairy tale where we see that Posy consults Sophie about fashion. There's actually a sweet little callback to the Perrault fairy tale where we see that Posy consults Sophie about fashion because Sophie has great taste. Araminta very openly favors Rosamond over Posy. She puts all of the family's resources into getting Rosamond ready to make a great match, getting her extravagant clothes, getting her lessons, getting her sent to all the right parties. We are told that Rosamond, who is blonde and thin, is much more beautiful than her sister. Other characters do seem to share Araminta's opinion that Rosamond is much more attractive. They're just not such jerks about it. When Benedict meets the sisters for the first time, we are in his point of view, and we see his impressions of them.
One of them was far too blonde, and besides, she held herself with a prissy, rather affected manner. The other looked friendly enough, but she was too chubby, and her hair was too dark. He made a point of fawning over the chubby one, if only because her mother so obviously preferred the other.
So we do the whole Cinderella thing. Sophie sneaks into a masked ball. She meets Benedict. They are instantly smitten, but she runs away at midnight. He tries to find her. He has a glove she left behind. He uses that to try to track her down, but is unsuccessful. Araminta has already realized what has happened and has kicked Sophie out of the house, and she has fled into the country. It's not until several years later that Benedict and Sophie are reunited, basically by chance. Benedict does not recognize Sophie as the mystery lady from the ball. As far as he's aware, they just met, but he really, really likes her. He is instantly smitten with this, he supposes, servant. And he has learned that if he meets a woman and he really likes her and he lets her get away, he will not see her again, so he's not letting this one go. And he becomes an absolute menace. He darn near kidnaps her. He leverages his status to coerce and threaten her into coming back to London with him, and he sets her up as a maid in his mother's household, and he pressures her to become his permanent mistress. Eventually, of course, all these secrets come out. Benedict realizes that Sophie was the mystery lady from the ball, and Araminta realizes that Sophie is back in town and has her arrested. She has Sophie arrested for theft of a ring, which Sophie did not take, and a pair of shoe clips, which Sophie 100% did take. So Sophie is sitting there in a jail cell, sad and alone, when all of the characters converge for a final confrontation. Because Araminta is there because she's gloating, and then Benedict and Benedict's mom come in because they're looking for Sophie and want to save her, and then Posy bursts in. She dramatically reveals that Araminta is lying, that she knows where she's hidden this ring. She's made that up. And you know what? I took the shoe clips.
Put me in the cell with Sophie, Posy said dramatically, clasping one of her hands to her breast with great effect. If she is transported for theft, then I must be as well.
The Bridgertons, of course, get everything sorted. Neither of the girls has to be transported, but Posy has finally stood up to her mother. She risked everything to stop Araminta's scheme, and more importantly, she finally said out loud that it's not okay the way Sophie's been treated. She even reveals the truth about the missing dowry.
Oh, Sophie, Posy cried out, a well of tears bursting forth. I'm so sorry. I never stood up for you. I should have said something. I should have done something, but... Sophie shook her head. You were young. I was young. And I know better than anyone how difficult it is to defy her.
Of course, the good guys are all furious for the way that Araminta has mistreated poor Sophie, but they have a particular ire for the way she has mistreated Posy. Posy, this perfectly nice girl who has spent her whole life trying to please her mother and been completely rejected. Throughout this whole encounter, this whole confrontation, Sophie has kept her composure, even while she's being insulted or threatened, but when Araminta says something really horrible to Posy, she just snaps. She gives her a very satisfying punch in the eye.
That was for not loving your daughters equally, Posy began to bawl. There's a special place in hell for mothers like you, Sophie said, her voice dangerously low.
Posy can't really go home with Araminta after everything that's happened, but it's totally fine. Mama Bridgerton has it taken care of. She says, Posy, come stay with us for a while. They make arrangements that Araminta will leave London for a little while, and Sophie and Benedict are able to live happily ever after, and it seems like Posy is going to be just fine. We actually get confirmation that Posy will be just fine in 2013 in a cute little book called, I think it's just called Happily Ever After, that checks in with the Bridgerton characters years later. The stories are referred to as second epilogues for each of the books, and newer editions actually include the second epilogue together with the original book. So I've heard from a lot of people that didn't pick these books up until the Netflix show was being made that didn't realize these chapters weren't originally part of the books. And the second epilogue for An Offer from a Gentleman is all about Posy. Sophie is living her happily ever after with Benedict in their quiet little country life, and she has stayed close with Posy. Posy is doing amazing. Okay, with the love and support from the Bridgerton family, she has really taken some time to work on herself. She's now 25, which in some circumstances might be alarmingly old, might make her a spinster, but everybody has decided that the years with Araminta don't count. Posy is having tea with Sophie and recounting to her that she ran into Araminta. This happens sometimes now that Araminta is back in London. They will run into each other while they're out, and it can be really distressing, but Posy has had a bit of a breakthrough. Seeing her mother did not bother her this time.
I must say, I was rather mature about the whole encounter. I let her say what she wished, and then I bid her goodbye. And then I had the most amazing realization. What is that? Posy gave a smile. I like myself.
I'm so proud of her. Sophie knows that Posy's gonna be okay, but she wants Posy to be as happy as she is. You know, she wants Posy to find love. So she keeps trying to set her up with men. Nothing has ever come of it before, but this time she has arranged for Posy to meet Mr. Woodson, the local vicar. And they're perfect for each other, and they know it immediately. They are instantly smitten. They can barely get through tea. They are too busy making eyes at each other, and they have a quick wedding and immediately start having children. They name their first children after Sophie and Benedict, and then the next two after Mr. Woodson's parents, and then they have a fifth child. They have a daughter, and Posy decides she wants to name her daughter Araminta.
I'm not naming her for my mother, Posy cut in gently. I'm naming her because of my mother. It's different.
They call the girl Minty, which they know that Araminta would hate. And we get to close the book knowing that Posy's gonna be, she's more than just fine. She's great. In 2025, the Netflix show, Bridgerton, adapted An Offer from a Gentleman as the main story for season 4. The show is definitely not married to the books in terms of plot or characterization, but when it comes to the Step family, the general setup is the same. We see tiny Sophie hoping that the sisters will be her friends, but Araminta's hatred of her prevents that from happening. Araminta openly favors Rosamond, who tries her best to catch Benedict's eye, and then eventually secures another good match. I'm not sure I'd say the show is sympathetic to Araminta, but it does let her get in a little speech, spilling the emotional drive behind her actions.
My girls needed a father. I needed his love. But instead you were there.
Posy is scorned and dismissed by her mother and sister, who insist she is embarrassing. Posy is even more adorable in the show.
And I was forced to walk across the stage with my feet hands. Anyway, that is why I can no longer attend the theatre.
She's a chatterbox with no filter. She's affectionate and joyful and creative. She has a very nice gentleman called Mr. Barnaby, desperate for a single dance. The stepsisters' role is pretty similar in the book and the show, but I wanted to keep them separate because their physical appearances are so different. I mean, obviously, everybody looks different because Bridgerton often shifts the ethnicity of characters, so the Penwood characters in the show are all played by British Asian actors, but there's also a big difference in the relative attractiveness of the two sisters. I was actually a little confused by this on first watch. If you look at the actors for Posey, Isabella Way, and Rosamond, Michelle Mao, it would be pretty hard to predict who is supposed to be the pretty one and who is supposed to be the homely one, right? But that's usually the case with these sisters, right? Most of the time in movies and TV, they're both lovely. I assumed we were supposed to suspend our disbelief about that and take our cue from the way the characters treat Posey, that she is supposed to be less attractive. Maybe I just assumed that because that's the situation in the book, but actually I don't think that's in the show. I don't think that's what the show is trying to tell us. Other characters reference Posey being awkward or exuberant or naive, but none of them reference her as being unattractive. At the end of the season, when the truth comes out about Araminta stealing Sophie's dowry, the sisters are shocked to learn that their own dowries are vastly different. Araminta took Sophie's portion and added it to Rosamond's dowry, which would then increase her value, her attractiveness on the marriage market.
£18,000. What is yours?
Rosamond is hurt and offended by this. She does not take this as a gift, but as a lack of faith.
Did you not believe my beauty and charm were enough on their own to make a match? You believed I needed £36,000.
Maybe Araminta added the money to Rosamond's dowry because she cares more about Rosamond and about seeing her married and happy, and she just doesn't care about Posey. But as a widow, she's very incentivized to get both of these girls married, so it does seem that Rosamond is right. It has more to do with Rosamond's prospects.
Apparently Lord Stotter is not content with Miss Lee's now inadequate dowry.
Araminta pragmatically thought Rosamond needed help that Posey didn't, implying that she does recognize Posey's charms. Maybe she does know deep down that Posey is nice. She is a sweet, kind girl, and there are people who will value that. Maybe we are supposed to see Posey as beautiful and desirable, and be unsurprised when she finds a good match. So, Disney's 1950 animated classic Cinderella basically follows the expected pattern for the stepsisters that we've been seeing on film, both because it is taking a traditional approach and because it becomes the model of expectations for film versions going forward. The wicked stepmother is the primary villainous character, and the stepsisters are more tools in her game than they are antagonists in their own right. They are mostly there for comedy and to provide that counter-example, an example of bad behavior to contrast with Cinderella's good behavior. It's interesting to note that the word ugly does not appear in the 1950 movie. These girls are never referred to as ugly or any other similar word. The most that is said about them is they are called awkward by the introductory narration.
Our own two awkward daughters.
But we are definitely supposed to find them ugly. Cinderella is animated in this very smooth, deliberate, graceful way, while their movements are jerky and uncoordinated and full of angles and long limbs. They have these really pronounced wrinkles on either side of their mouth, those like nasal folds that make them look prematurely aged, and they have large, oddly shaped noses. And Disney does later refer to them as the ugly stepsisters in products. Now, if we jump forward to the late 90s, Disney is revisiting Cinderella because it's revisiting all of its animated classics. Cinderella was one of a whole batch of movies that was going to be the basis for a TV show. A couple of these TV shows actually got made, some of them were completely scrapped, and a few, like Cinderella, had enough progress completed before the TV show was canceled that they wanted to recycle that material. So Cinderella 2, which came out in 2002, is essentially 3 episodes of the TV series strung together with a very loose framing device. Cinderella 2 is, in my humble opinion, a god-awful mess. And you might be expecting that. You know, you might say, oh, this is a cheaply made, straight-to-home video sequel. You know, they're never very good. Even by those standards, this one is really bad. It's a hard watch. There's a story about Cinderella getting used to life at the palace, which is really bad and really disconnected from her characterization in the original. And then there's a story about Jacques, or perhaps Jack. They say it both ways. They say it both ways in these movies. Jacques gets temporarily turned into a human and spends the whole time, like, what did the kids say, simping after Cinderella? It's really unsettling. By far, the best part of the movie is the storyline of Anastasia and her baker. We catch up with the Step family in the first year after Cinderella has moved out, and they're doing okay. They're miserable because they're miserable people, and they make each other miserable, but financially, they seem to be doing just fine. Anastasia has a chance run-in with a cute baker, and they are instantly smitten.
Would you like one?
Anastasia!
Lady Tremaine is not about this. This is not an advantageous marriage. She comes down hard, making this now a forbidden romance. Cinderella sees how upset Anastasia is and decides to help her. She gives her some words of encouragement and helps her put her best foot forward. There's a cute little makeover sequence, but the movie seems confused about whether this is a good thing or not. Like, she looks better, and it's good that Anastasia is embracing her true beauty, and it's bad that she's worried about her own appearance, and that's not what's important in making this relationship work.
The best way to impress the baker is just to be nice to him. You could start with a smile.
Better get me a bigger necklace.
I'm left a little confused about the message here. They seem to be making a big deal about the idea that appearance isn't what matters, but this relationship hasn't had time to develop beyond appearance. It's basically just based on appearance. So they're sort of scolding Anastasia for doing the only thing that's working.
Well, of course you want to look your best, but that's not the most important thing.
After several missed connections, in the end, Anastasia stands up to the stepmother and declares that she will go to the ball with this baker, whatever her mom says.
He's sweet.
She's wonderful.
And we are going to the ball together.
Oh, I don't really know what happens after this. I'm not sure if this was supposed to be a big enough conflict that, like, Anastasia can't go home with the Tremaines, and maybe she, like, moves in with the baker now or already, or maybe Lady Tremaine's just gonna take this. She's gonna accept this, and Anastasia will go back home and live. I don't know. But the ball is great. We have a happy ending at the ball, and we even have a little moment showing that Drizella is wondering, what if? There are some doubts there. There's also a B-plot where the mice help Lucifer woo a really, really thick, with 3 C's, girl cat. And it's disturbing. Cinderella 2 doesn't go all the way to retconning Anastasia's behavior from the first movie. It doesn't give us, like, a secret reason she acted that way, but it definitely softens her considerably. I have a hard time believing that the Anastasia we meet at the beginning of this movie would have done something like tear Cinderella's dress from her violently. She would say rude things to Cinderella, but I don't know that she'd go that far. So she's already starting out a lot nicer, and then we see a big change of heart. She is love-struck, and that changes her. She has found her man, and therefore glows. But because this is a sequel, and all of this is taking place chronologically after the events of the Cinderella story, I don't really consider this a good stepsister character. For that, we need to look to Cinderella 3, A Twist in Time, 2007. Was Cinderella 2 terrible? Yes. Did it make a lot of money? Also, yes. So we're doing a threequel. And this time, it seems like they got a little silly with it. Not only were they not committed to using recycled material from a TV show, but it seems like the filmmakers did not have a lot of instruction from Disney. By all accounts, the writer and director were given basically free rein to do whatever they wanted, and what they wanted to do was weird. When Cinderella 3 begins, we are catching up with these characters shortly after the end of the first movie, but this is not in the same canon as Cinderella 2. We can already see that the Step family is in a much worse spot. As soon as the film begins, Anastasia is already breaking my little heart. She wonders when it will be her turn to be a princess, which at first seems like greed. She wants wealth and power and importance, but she starts to sing, letting us into her deeper thoughts and letting us know that she is a proper Disney protagonist.
Somewhere there must be someone who'll love me.
We see that her more superficial desires are actually driven by an unmet need for affection and love and appreciation and belonging, which she's not getting from her family. Anastasia literally watches Cinderella in her happiness, just like we have been. She's now standing in for the viewer, for the audience that has been raised on fairy tales, but can't seem to find that happily ever after that was promised. She's being told that something about her her is not suited to that happily ever after, and she's starting to believe it. Maybe she's just broken. When Anastasia finds the fairy godmother's magic wand,
Mother, our troubles are over!
A stick.
Ooh, let's beat her with it.
she hopes this will save the family from their present discomfort. The stepmother apparently knows how to use it. She knows magic, and she turns back time so that they can redo the moment when the slipper fits Cinderella. She magically grows the slipper so that it will fit on one of Anastasia's huge feet, and the family is whisked off to the palace. Cinderella is left behind, confused and devastated, but this is 2007. This is new empowered Cinderella, so she doesn't stay down for long. She's going after her man. At the palace, the step-family is a hot mess. They are classless and graceless, and Anastasia is completely unconvincing. The prince can tell immediately that this is not the girl he danced with, so the stepmother uses more magic to alter his memory, forcing him to believe it was Anastasia all along. And suddenly, her awkwardness is endearing instead of disgusting. This is his true love, so her horrible family must be accepted. The prince shows Anastasia the first teaspoon of care and respect and affection, honestly just politeness, and she completely melts. And of course, nobody has been more excited about this match than the prince's father, the king, and he enthusiastically welcomes his soon-to-be daughter-in-law. He tells Anastasia about his late wife, who actually kind of looks like Anastasia. They have a lot in common, he says, and his marriage was a love match too. And we see that this is what Anastasia has been desperate for.
Now there is finally someone to love me.
She likes the idea of being a princess, sure. She wants the romance. She likes the adoration of a handsome prince. But she doesn't want any of those things enough to overcome her growing guilt at what she's done to Cinderella and the shame of knowing that she stole this position. No, the thing that she's desperate for, desperate enough to overcome her growing conscience, is this paternal love. It's never mentioned outright, but it's impossible to ignore the fact that Anastasia has now lost two father figures. Her own biological father died when she was very young, and then she gained a stepfather, who we know to have been a decent man who was probably very kind to her. Anastasia might have thought she was about to have a true father in her life again, and then he died too. But now this man is looking at her like she's already his daughter, and he doesn't think she's falling short. He doesn't think she's broken. He's comparing her to his own wife, who he adored enough to commission massive portraits and keep her things as prized possessions. How could she give that up? Somehow, she does. The mice help out, they speak to the prince, and somehow, unlike everybody else in the world but Cinderella, he hears and understands.
Hey, Princey! Princey!
Over here!
I love this scene so much. It's basically the same scene as when the hot priest in Fleabag looks at the camera for the first time. That's what you call soulmates.
But the talking mice say she's the wrong girl.
Cinderella is able to get to the prince at last. They touch, and that snaps him out of the magic spell. The stepmother has Cinderella arrested, and it's weird that that keeps happening, right? It seems like whenever we have a good stepsister, Cinderella ends up arrested, and I'm not sure we have enough data to prove causation, but it's weird that it happened 3 times in a row. Cinderella is put on a ship. Presumably, she's going to be transported to Australia, but the prince rescues her just in time, and everything is put to rights. But the stepmother has one more trick up her sleeve. She magically transforms Anastasia to appear identical to Cinderella. She's even wearing the wedding dress from the original. She clearly feels horrible about it, but she insists that she doesn't have a choice. This is her only chance.
I want what you had.
And in the final moments, she can't do it. She won't say the vows.
Don't.
She has gotten just a taste of this kind of love, and she now values it too much to let it be misspent.
But I want someone to love me for me.
Anastasia defies her mother finally, and she helps Cinderella and the prince be reunited. With the power of love and friendship, and also swords, the good guys win. Even though this is still a sequel, I am willing to consider Anastasia a proper good stepsister character in this story, because we are placed back within the confines of a Cinderella tale proper. From Anastasia's point of view, this is a sequel. She's lived through the entire experience of the original movie. But from Cinderella's point of view, we are still in the first movie. She went to the ball, and then immediately all this stuff happened. In the 1950 film, just before the final victory, there is a moment when all seems lost. Just before Cinderella can put the shoe on, the stepmother trips the page holding the slipper. It falls to the ground and shatters. Lady Tremaine has made her final play to prevent Cinderella's happiness, but ultimately still fails. Cinderella has the other slipper because there is magic and hope within her that the stepmother has never been able to snuff out. Cinderella 3 basically lives within this moment. You can look at the whole movie as being an expansion of a plot point within the original story. It's not a story about what happens after the happily ever after, it's just another obstacle. As usual, all the elements that are classic were actually created in the 50s, and everything that is new and updated and fresh is centuries old. This story is very reminiscent of versions of the fairy tale that include an attempt by the stepfamily to usurp Cinderella's place even after the wedding. It echoes the second half of Fair, Brown, and Trembling, where Cinderella is sent into the sea so that the stepsister can take her place. It's especially like the Hearth-Cat, where the stepsister doesn't seem to want anything to do with this plan, but the stepmother forces her to take on the disguise and pretend to be the princess. For a time, it seems like the prince is going to be fooled, but Cinderella makes it back in the end. Essentially, Cinderella and Cinderella 3 are a retelling of the Hearth-Cat. But unlike in those fairy tales, the disguised daughter is not horribly punished along with her mother. Here, the good guys are ready to forgive and reconcile. In the end credits, we even see the baker from Cinderella 2 make a little cameo, suggesting that in this timeline too, Anastasia will find her own romance and happily ever after. Frank Neeson, the director of Cinderella 3, spoke about how important it was to him to stay true to the spirit of the original while doing something new. Neeson says they looked only to the original for inspiration and almost entirely ignored Cinderella 2. We knew we could get a lot more story dynamics out of having one of the other two characters go through more change, rather than just focusing the whole story on Cinderella. Again, if you think about the first movie as the origin myth, so to speak, that's the core emotional dilemma. Cinderella wants love, and she eventually finds love at the end of the first story. So what we wanted to do was create another story that had a strong emotional core, but that gave more characters within the little universe more complexity. They knew they wanted to create a storyline for one of the stepsisters and didn't seem to have any preference for which one, so since Anastasia was the one who got the complexity in Cinderella 2, they decided to continue that choice in Cinderella 3. They say that's the only thing they took. Cinderella doesn't have a huge cast of characters, but there were a handful that could have gotten this treatment. It makes sense to look at one of the villains to potentially give a redemption arc, but it's interesting that they look to the stepsisters and not the stepmother to add complexity to a villainous character. It was a big challenge keeping the evil stepmother as suppressed as she is. The modern taste for villains is a much broader character, so the challenge was to create a really good villain but stay true to what was in the first movie. When storytellers want to add complexity, when they want to add a level of emotional realism and nuance to this story, they keep reaching for the stepsisters and reaching for this good stepsister characterization. The stepmother's old, maybe she's calcified and incapable of further change now, or maybe we think the way she is the result of her choices as a fully cognizant adult. But the stepsisters, they're so young. They're so young. One has to wonder what it would be like being raised by Lady Tremaine from such a young age. What if those were the expectations you had to live up to, but deep down, there was a better person? In 2004, we get another Cinderella film that really well encapsulates the spirit of the era. A Cinderella Story starring Hilary Duff and also Chad Michael Murray and also Regina King and also, of course, Jennifer Coolidge is a modern retelling of Cinderella that's just, like, so excited about being a modern retelling of Cinderella.
In a land called Los Angeles.
If you will allow me to share with you something terrible for a second, A Cinderella Story 2004 has an 11% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes. 11%? I had to close my laptop and leave my apartment. I had to walk out the door. Why does nobody appreciate cinema? Now, A Cinderella Story does not have a good stepsister character. The two stepsisters are basically the same. They're equally terrible, but it's worth noting how harmless they are. These girls are rude to Sam, our Cinderella character, and they take advantage of the work that she's forced to do. But man, they're really not that bad. This plotline does demand some mean girl activities, so they literally create a new character for that. They make a new character called Shelby, who is totally separate from the stepsister. She's not even, like, connected to the family, and she does all the jobs that you might expect the stepsisters to do. She acts as a romantic rival for the prince character. She actively sabotages Sam. Somehow, the stepsisters have become totally defanged, but their presence presence is so necessary to have a recognizable Cinderella story that people will literally create like a third dude, make a third person so that they can have it both ways. They can have evil stepsisters and also have completely harmless stepsisters. Crazy stuff. Also in 2004, we have more Shrek. Shrek 2 introduces the character of Doris like this.
I'm looking for the ugly stepsister.
Buddy, let me clue you in.
Based on what's actually in this movie, there's not really an indication whether Doris is a woman who looks a lot like a man or whether she is like a man dressed up as a woman. And we simply don't have time to get into Doris discourse, but trust that it does exist. Doris is obviously supposed to be funny. Like, the whole thing is supposed to be funny. Her introduction is supposed to be a laugh line. But it turns out that Doris is totally solid and a fan favorite, so they bring her back in Shrek the Third in 2007. At some point between the second and third movies, Doris has been fully integrated into Princess Fiona's friend group. She has like a girl squad of other princesses and also Doris. And she's probably the only one that I would want to hang out with. Like, she is so much more pleasant and helpful than any of the rest of them. And in Shrek the Third, we also meet Mabel, who is the other stepsister who has basically the same deal, whatever that deal is.
Why they call you an ugly stepsister, I'll never know.
But Mabel aligns with the villains. They are fighting on opposite sides. Sister turned against sister. So for a minute, we do kind of have a good stepsister dynamic, because one of them's with the good guys and one of them is with the bad guys. But eventually, all is forgiven. They reconcile in the end. You'll love to see sisters hugging it out. And rounding out our 10-year Y2K Good Stepsister extravaganza is Year of the Fish. Year of the Fish is a modern retelling of Xian. Actually, it's Xian with a good pinch of Western Cinderella thrown in there. So, for example, we have two stepsisters, because that's what you have in a Cinderella. In this version, the family is family in a much looser sense. So Xian has been sent to New York to this woman who is her mother's cousin, and she's there essentially to work off debt. All of the young women who work at this establishment of ill repute refer to this woman as Ma, and so they are in a sisterhood of sorts, but none of them are actually related. So it's not the classic Cinderella setup, but it's definitely weird family stuff. So in Year of the Fish, both of these stepsister-inspired characters are in some way sympathetic because they're in such a bad situation. We don't know exactly how they ended up in this position. It's very possible they were forced into it like Xian, or had something else terrible happen in their lives. So they're both having a rough time, but one of them is a jerk about it, and then the other one is nice. She's more encouraging, but in kind of a cynical way. She accepts life as it is and encourages Xian to do the same.
Just stay away from Vinny when he's drunk and do what Ma says. You'll be fine.
She doesn't do anything to protect Xian or change her own position, not quite because she's terrified or feels powerless like in other versions, but because she just doesn't see the point. She can't change anything, so it's better not to rock the boat. But in the end, though, in the final moments when the prince character is looking for Xian and it doesn't look like he's going to be able to find her, our good stepsister steps up.
Wait! Xian is here. Back in the laundry room.
She tells this nice young man where to find Xian and facilitates their happily ever after. And good for her. Hi, I hope you're enjoying the video. A couple quick things. If you've noticed the numbers in this yeah, they're in this corner. Those numbers are the citations for the sources. I get a lot of questions about where I found certain footage, or where you can learn more about a particular topic, or where you can, fact check a claim I made, and all you have to do is look at that number and go to the link in my description where you can see all of the sources laid out so pretty. That document is in a public post in my Patreon, so it's free to access. You shouldn't even need to be logged in to see it. But using a separate document allows me to include a lot more text and to directly hyperlink things, which YouTube doesn't want me to do. They want me to suffer. And while you're over there to fact check me, please consider checking out my Patreon community, which is very, very literally what makes all of this possible. I am so passionate about mega deep dives like this. They are my favorite thing to make, and they are very time intensive and take a lot of research. I want to give you guys the best context possible for the things I'm telling you, so I have a really high standard for the sources that I reference. I am very careful to keep notes of them so that you guys are able to find them after the fact, and so that the people that I am learning from or quoting or referencing get proper attribution and credit. These videos represent my 100% original work. At this time, I have no co-writers or editors, and there was absolutely no generative AI or large language models used in the research, writing, outlining, editing, fact-checking, literally any part of the creation of this video. If those things are important to you, and if you want to see more videos like this in the future, please consider joining the lovely, delightful community over at my Patreon. I cannot emphasize enough how linear the relationship is between that support and my ability to create things like this, which are not algorithm friendly and don't often perform well on YouTube, and how linear the relationship is between my growth on Patreon and my ability to spend more time doing this. You can join starting at a few dollars per month for early access and sneak previews of works like this. For access to our book club, this month we are reading Disney High, about the history of Disney Channel. Our very cozy slumber party streams, where we get in pajamas and together go through a vintage edition of American Girl magazine, and all sorts of other fun shenanigans, but mostly you get the satisfaction and pride of being a patron of the arts and knowing that you have made this possible. It means the world to me that my videos, especially niche, overly long videos like this, find a home, find an audience that values it. It makes a huge difference to know that I'm not speaking into the void, so if my content has been a companion for you today, please consider leaving a comment to let me know, and sharing, liking, subscribing, pushing all the buttons that make this possible. Thank you so much. Please enjoy the rest of the video. There was something going on in the late 90s and early 2000s because a bunch of different storytellers all at the same time had this impulse to differentiate the stepsisters significantly, and in many cases to have this good stepsister characterization. So why include a good stepsister character? Like, what is that doing for your story? For one thing, she helps ground the story in a more complex world with more realistic characters. Having two sisters who act in the exact same way with the exact same personality reads very fairy tale, reads very children's story. When you differentiate the stepsisters, that allows them to act more like characters in a novel or in a feature film. This is more of a genre shift than anything. Maybe it's as simple as the fact that a longer and more complex work can handle a greater number of distinct characters. But many of these works go beyond that. They don't just give one of the stepsisters more personality, they give her a whole character arc. But they don't give her a completely separate story from Cinderella. She's not the B story. Her plotline is intertwined with what's going on with Cinderella. She's adding something back into the Cinderella fairy tale plot, beyond just the fact that she's made the world more interesting and compelling. One role she plays is to simply stand witness to Cinderella's mistreatment. There is another person in the room now who sees how horribly this girl is being treated and understands it to be horrible, which as the viewer or the reader is very satisfying and validating. She's a little bit of an audience surrogate that allows us to react with horror, and it's satisfying to see that somebody else knows what Cinderella has suffered and how much she has earned her happy ending. The Cinderella character almost always has a couple good friends that she can confide in, but it's different when it is somebody else inside the family system, inside that weird family stuff. Now, the classic wicked stepsisters are playing a role of the moral counterexample. Their wickedness is showing how good Cinderella's goodness is. But if we have virtuous Cinderella and the bad stepsister and the good stepsister, ooh, now we have multiple points of contrast in different directions. Cinderella and the bad stepsister continue to be juxtaposed against each other as virtue versus badness, but now the stepsisters are points of contrast with each other, because these are two girls who were raised in the same environment, or in a similar environment, and turned out very differently. Things aren't quite so simple anymore. We no longer have raised in privilege versus raised in hardship, or raised by a terrible mother versus raised by a wonderful mother. Now you have two sisters with the same terrible mother as an example, but one of them followed in their mother's footsteps and one of them hasn't. Perhaps this is because they were raised differently, even in the same house. This goes to show how complicated this family system is. This weird family stuff is really, really weird. The stepmother plays favorites. She fosters competition between her two daughters. And even though these girls are raised in luxury and comfort, and they don't have to work the way that Cinderella does, You get the sense that they are also in some way being mistreated. They are being morally neglected and emotionally abused. The good stepsister can serve as a window into some quieter and more difficult kinds of dysfunction. Or perhaps the good stepsister is showing the way that two people can respond to similar circumstances very differently. Maybe the fact that she turned out so different from her sister just proves that the way her sister turned out was a choice. Would seem to prove that even with a terrible upbringing, even with a terrible example, a person can learn and should learn goodness. To the extent that Cinderella is a story about virtue, a story about showing the rewards and punishment of good or bad actions, then having a good stepsister pushes the story beyond a simple binary of good and bad, beyond the implication that goodness or badness is something inherent within you that potentially you're even born with. It wades into trickier waters of nature versus nurture, and would seem to make the case that who we are and how we behave is more in our power than not. Especially when you compare the good stepsister to Cinderella, because the good stepsister behaves much better than the bad stepsister, but she is not as good of a person as Cinderella. Specifically, she lacks Cinderella's courage.
I would not have survived in that house without you. You were always so kind and courageous.
The good stepsister at some point knows deep in her heart that what the stepmother is doing is wrong, but is scared to stand up to her, and potentially she's willing to compromise on what she knows is right to maintain her position, because she's scared of losing the status and comfort that she has.
She should not have said that about your mother.
I wish I had said this to you before, but the things she has always said about you, about your mother, they are cruel and untrue.
In that way, she is still serving as a moral counterexample to Cinderella. She's showing somebody that knows the right thing to do, but can't bring herself to do it. In the end, all of this still contributes to the positioning of Cinderella as morally superior, that her virtue has earned her this happily ever after. And while we can't all be perfect as Cinderella, we can all try our best, and maybe, like the good stepsister, we can rethink the things we've done wrong and earn, if not perfect paradise, maybe a sort of lower middle heaven. Now, Cinderella is also in large part a story about beauty, and the good stepsister complicates that too. A Cinderella retelling can have a lot of different takes about beauty. The fairy tale certainly did, but when you have two stepsisters that behave the same way and look basically the same way, your statement about beauty can at least be internally consistent. You can either have a world that equates beauty and virtue, where the bad people are ugly and the good people are pretty, or you can specifically have a story that undermines that. The stepsisters are beautiful, but they are cruel and heartless, and ultimately that makes them beautiful in the wrong way, because Cinderella, while less beautiful, is actually somehow more beautiful. Once you have a good stepsister, however she looks, it's not going to be a simple either or. Those ideas about virtue and those ideas about beauty have gotten commingled in a really interesting way. If the sisters are similar in appearance, but very different in behavior, then that kind of uncouples the concepts of beauty and goodness in your story, right? In fact, it shifts the focus of the story away from beauty in general. This would serve a story where happy endings are earned through virtue and through suffering, and it would probably be more attractive to an audience that might object to being told that being beautiful earns you a happy ending. But it's more often the case that the good stepsister doesn't look like the bad stepsister, that they are distinct in appearance, and the good stepsister is much less attractive. And there actually seems to be a connection there, right? It seems that her lack of beauty is connected to her goodness, because that has informed the way she's moved through the world. The older sister is mom's favorite because she's prettier. The older sister is going to make a more advantageous match because she's prettier. Beauty is access and privilege that she doesn't have, that she's missing out on even with all of her other advantages. And in some ways, that would make her relate to Cinderella. Cinderella, who is in overall a worse situation, is much more beautiful, and that ends up working to her favor, because even if her virtue is what earns her her happy ending, her beauty is what gets her her happy ending. But Cinderella's beauty is a superior kind of beauty. It's a natural beauty, unlike the bad stepsister's beauty, which she gets through primping and planning and controlling and vanity. This is a beauty produced by vanity, which is bad. trying to be beautiful and succeeding is really bad. And trying to be beautiful but failing is pretty good. And then the best thing, of course, is to not try to be beautiful and be beautiful. Unless this is a world in which being not beautiful is the worst thing, because that means you have bad taste. Because actually beauty does equal virtue, because beauty is an expression of your taste and your artistry. So that makes it really a moral choice to be beautiful. And of course, what distinguishes bad taste from good taste is effort. Bad taste is effortful and good taste is effortless. So it's really important that you achieve it but not try to achieve it. Something's going on here, something tricksy, something nefarious, something that's giving unrealistic beauty standards, something that's giving tabloid cover, something that's giving post-feminism. It's starting to make sense that these movies were made in the 90s. The good thing is the 90s were super normal about women. Just kidding, they were super not normal about women, just like every other time ever. A super fun and flirty thing about the 90s and 2000s is that apparently two things were true at once. Apparently, feminism was over, having completely succeeded, hooray, and the girls are not okay. The girls are doing really, really bad. During this period, you had people insisting both of those things really, really loudly, which is confusing because it was so great to be a woman, right? It was the year of the woman in the US Senate, and like Lilith Fair was amazing and sold a bunch of tickets, and then they all went home to have babies. And girl power, everybody was talking about girl power. It was wall-to-wall girl power. In the early 90s, you had a wave of academic studies and books aimed at parents and a lot of like highfalutin discourse about how bad girls are doing. The girls are in fact in a crisis. There was a girl crisis. You've heard of girl dinner, now try girl crisis. Reviving Ophelia in 1994 said the United States was a girl-destroying place. In 1992, Meeting at the Crossroads, girls were being tortured by their inability to live up to the standard of perfection. Book clubs are reading The Beauty Myth, and talk shows are doing specials on eating disorders, and people are talking about heroin chic. Popular culture is the most visible and the most, I guess, exciting battleground for these kinds of issues. Of course, this is all playing out in education, in schools, in politics, but we want to talk about how this looks on TV. And even though the people who created pop culture at this time were being like openly, proudly, vilely misogynistic, somehow we all decided that this was really girls' fault. Yes, girls are in an unprecedented crisis. It's really, really hard to be a woman right now, but like really this is their own fault because they are setting a bad example for each other. You know, the really bad thing that little girls are up against is the fact that they have poor role models in media. The older girls and young women in media are giving them a poor example. And also, the other thing wrong with girls is that they have poor self-esteem. It's ultimately their fault that they are not thriving because they don't believe in themselves enough. So if they would believe in themselves more and then like be better, then they would be better. I didn't expect I was going to get so heated about this, but this is something I remember from my own childhood. I remember there being this like ambient cultural anxiety about girls' self-esteem, that our self-esteem was somehow broken. And nobody had any idea how to fix it. But it was definitely girls that needed to do the changing and the fixing, right? This definitely wasn't a problem with society or anything crazy like that. It's the girls who are wrong. The more I read of this period, the more it makes sense that this is a time to be retelling Cinderella, which is a story not just about a woman who is good, but about a good woman, about somebody who is being a woman well. If the culture is obsessed with watching women who are not womaning well, then it's time to get out Cinderella, and more importantly, time to get out the Stepsisters. There was something in the air about womanhood being expressed and understood in twos, in dualities or binaries, blonde versus brunette, Barbie versus American Girl, Tanya versus Nancy, this idea of the double bind. And it's a time when people were very interested in the spectacle, the dark spectacle of beauty as something bloody and something self-injurious. I kept thinking of the versions of the Fairytale Stepsisters that stare into their mirror for hours, that cinch themselves tighter and tighter with their corset laces, that cut off their heels and toes and mutilate their bodies in search of perfection. Something about that kept echoing through this decade. This is the media environment that produced the character type of the good stepsister. And what I've come to think is that the creation of a good stepsister figure is coming from a post-feminist impulse. Post-feminism is one of those fun words which has so many meanings that it's virtually useless, like people just kind of make up what they want it to mean that day. So let me tell you what I mean by it today. I'm going to use Rosalind's Gill framework for post-feminism, and she defines it not really as an ideology, like not as a way of thinking about the world, but as a sensibility expressed in media culture. It's not pro-feminist or anti-feminist. It's not actually a coherent perspective on feminism. It's not a political philosophy about women in society. It's a collection of tastes and preferences in the way that women are presented in media. That's images, storytelling, fiction and nonfiction, in the news. What makes contemporary meaning early 2000s, media culture distinctively post-feminist rather than pre-feminist or anti-feminist is precisely this entanglement of feminist and anti-feminist ideas. Feminism is not ignored or even attacked, as some backlash theorists might have it, but is simultaneously taken for granted and repudiated. The Cinderella retellings I've talked about in this video, many of them are quite different, but there is something very similar about their Cinderella characters. Most of them have a very Y2K girl power sort of vibe about them. They are independent in a strong but totally vague way, with a very loose grasp on any personal ideals or values or motivations outside of their pursuit of the happily ever after. They like to turn to the camera and announce that they are taking control and that this movie is not like other Cinderellas, and then they just kind of do the same thing. They are aimless in a way that makes it appear that the real goal is declaring autonomy and not actually having autonomy. This is actually very directly what Ella Enchanted is about, which is part of why I consider that story to be feminist in a way that most of the others are not. The patterned nature of the contradictions is what constitutes the sensibility, one in which notions of autonomy, choice, and self-improvement sit side by side with surveillance, discipline, and the vilification of those who make the wrong choices, become too fat, too thin, or have the audacity or bad judgment to grow older. Gill lays out a handful of elements of the post-feminist sensibility. One of them she refers to as the makeover paradigm, which is very relevant to Cinderella. It also includes a focus on discipline and self-surveillance, as well as an obsessive preoccupation with the body. The body is presented simultaneously as women's source of power and as always unruly, requiring constant monitoring, surveillance, discipline, and remodeling and consumer spending in order to conform to ever narrower judgments of female attractiveness. It's also defined by a neoliberal outlook in which the individual must bear full responsibility for their life biography, no matter how severe the constraints upon their action. Sophie Gilbert, in her book Girl on Girl, had an interesting observation about this. The qualities of post-feminism are also all the defining characteristics of reality TV. This was a medium that, during the aughts, watched women, weighed them, waxed them, cut them open, groomed them to be more feminine, trained them to be more ladylike. So Cinderella, this very old fairy tale that has shown great flexibility to lend itself to different messages and morals, what would a post-feminist Cinderella be like? It would be crucial to show that Cinderella is not trying to be attractive. And the other side of the coin is that in a post-feminist Cinderella, the stepsisters' undesirability reflects poorly on their character. In fact, it has to ultimately be their fault. In post-feminist media, there's one very narrow way to be a good woman and endless ways to be a bad woman. So I guess it's no surprise that we see more variety in the ways that female characters can fall short. Because I call her the good stepsister, but she's only good by comparison to the bad stepsister. She's not as good as Cinderella. She is falling short. And when we look at some of these stories as post-feminist works, it becomes more clear why some of them don't make any sense, at least when it comes to their presentation of beauty. Because post-feminism itself isn't a coherent perspective. It doesn't value any virtue in particular. It just values having a woman to scold.
Why? Why must we feel that way, nurse? What is the dimensional difference between beauty and something repellent? Why shouldn't people be allowed to be different? Why?
A really fun thing about being a content creator is that you get to spend all of your time looking at your own face. A human being is not meant to look at their own face that much. I think we can't handle it. I think it's bad for you. I think our caveman ancestors saw their reflection in a beautiful, clear pond a couple times a week, and that was it, and that's enough. Frankly, it's bad enough that we see photos of ourselves. It's unnatural, much less stare at a live moving picture of our own faces for hours at a time. So about a year ago, I took down all of the mirrors in my apartment, except for the one in the bathroom. I have one in the bathroom that I use to brush my teeth and wash my face, except for like now when I decided to do it in my chair. Because if there's a mirror there, you're gonna look at yourself. People love looking at themselves. It's why they put mirrors in elevators so you don't notice how long the ride is because you're too busy looking at yourself. So I just took down the mirrors that were in my bedroom. And you know what? I think it helped. I have fewer of those moments where I look at myself and can no longer recognize a human face. You know, when you say one word too many times in a row and it no longer sounds like a real word, that's what happens to my face when I've been creating content too long. So it was good for me. It was good for my mental health, but I feel weird about it. And I have never told anybody that I did this. In fact, you're hearing about it now for the first time because it's something I've been embarrassed to admit because I know that I'm supposed to think I'm hot. If I was really doing so well, if I was really so healthy and so well adjusted, I would have the ultimate mark of good self-esteem, which is, of course, thinking that you're hot. And I know that's insane. I know in my mind that there's no actual relation to anybody's impression of my physical attractiveness, including my own, and whether I am a healthy and well-adjusted person. But the media that I consume places an extremely high value on that. An extremely high value of not on loving yourself despite how you look, not on being confident despite how you look, but on actively loving how you look, on thinking that you're the hottest bitch there's ever been. Because otherwise, what? You have low self-esteem? That's embarrassing. That's a character flaw. A thing I see people say about celebrities daily online. This is how you age when you're unproblematic. And the inverse, too. This is what it looks like when you're a bad person. The stress of being hateful and mean gives you wrinkles, gives you acne, gives you spots and sagging skin. This person wears good makeup because she has good taste because she's a good person. And this person wears ugly makeup because she has bad taste, because she's a bad person. People have always thought like this on some level. It's a well-studied phenomenon that we subconsciously think better of prettier people. We just assume that they are smarter and nicer and better people, even without any evidence. But in some circles, that's something that people are embarrassed about. That's an unconscious bias that they wish they didn't have and they would never want to publicly acknowledge. It would be impolite or humiliating to acknowledge that you are prejudiced that way. People on the internet, the corners of the internet that I often inhabit, don't have that kind of inhibition about it. They feel comfortable being open and proud about the fact that they believe that physical beauty is a manifestation of inner goodness. And more importantly, that unattractiveness is a manifestation of evil. I think those people are wrong. You know, they don't control how I see myself and others, but I'm not going to say it never bothers me or that I'm not very conscious of it when I put my face out on the internet. I think about those posts sometimes while I do the 40-minute makeup routine that I do before I film for one of these videos. For the record, I like doing pretty makeup. I like picking out cute outfits and having a little dress-up moment. It's fun, but it's a lot less fun when you feel like it's something you have to do for people to tolerate you being on their phone screens. Sometimes I feel a little resentful of how much I think about my appearance in this job. The time and money that I spend on makeup alone, I mean, that could be put to other uses. And not to be like, if I was a man, but like, if I was a man, I'd have that 40 minutes back. I could be reading more fairy tale books. But if time spent thinking about my own appearance is wasted, then how wasted is time spent thinking about how much I'm thinking about my own appearance? It's hard not to be resentful when I feel pressure to do these things and then feel pressure to like it. I'm supposed to be happy about this. I'm supposed to be enjoying it. I'm supposed to do my 40-minute makeup routine with joy because I'm doing it for myself. I'm doing it for myself. I'm not supposed to be upset about losing those 40 minutes and somehow imply that I can't be doing both, that I can't be wearing mascara and reading my fairy tale books. Of course I can. I can do it all. But there's no amount of self-esteem that gives me more than 24 hours in a day. There's no amount of confidence that makes it not a zero-sum game, that every minute I spend thinking about my own appearance is a minute I don't think about something that matters. I generally follow the Jemima Kirk school of thought about self-confidence, that we might be thinking about ourselves too much, and that sometimes it really is a problem of self-obsession, which can't be fixed with more self-obsession. I wish I thought about myself less. Which is also a thought about myself. It makes you wonder if, as a culture, we could maybe use fewer stories that are about Cinderellas and ugly stepsisters, and more stories about people who just kind of look how they look, and it's not their whole deal. It would be nice to spend a little while in a fictional world where nobody really cares. Well, it's tomorrow. I'm back in the building because it's time to yap more. And to yap more, we need to put more stuff back on our face. And it never ends. So the Good Stepsister characters we've talked about are actually really similar in their personality as well as their position in the story. Putting aside the characters that are in fairy tale remixes or fairy tale references more than they are in fairy tale retellings, for proper Good Stepsister characters, we have Anastasia in the Disney Cinderella sequels. We have Jacqueline in Ever After, we have Posy in An Offer from a Gentleman, and we have the nice salon worker in Year of the Fish. She does not have a name. I really drove myself crazy trying to find the name of this character, and I'm pretty sure she doesn't have one. IMDb credits her as salon worker, and I don't want to call her that, so we're going to call her Sally. We don't get to know Sally's personality as much as the others. She gets a lot less screen time, but she hits a lot of the same notes. One thing you'll notice is that these characters tend to not be very bright. They are not like Olive, they're not like Ruth, they're not like irretrievably dense. They're perfectly able to move through the world, but they're going to be a little slower on the uptake about things. They're going to be a little less aware in social situations. They lack intelligence in a way that reads as childish and naive and trusting. You could argue Sally is an exception to this because she seems a little more pragmatic, a little bit more aware of the way the world works, but I think you can also argue that she's trusting in the authority figures around her. She really believes the best thing for her to do is to just follow directions. And that's what a good stepsister does. A good stepsister follows directions above all, at least when we first meet her. She's being raised by this mother who is very demanding, and she has learned not to rock the boat, and she is earnestly trying her best. She doesn't want to make trouble. She doesn't want anybody to be unhappy. In fact, that's probably the thing she wants most, is for everybody around to just be happy. And ideally, she herself would be happy too, but that's something she's either learned not to expect or something she thinks she can make for herself if she's just left alone. To the extent that we see her being selfish when we meet her, it's more of a territorial, protective instinct. She's scared of losing what she has. She feels her situation is really precarious. She actually has the potential deep down to be quite kind-hearted. She's probably very sensitive. She's bullied by her mother and sister, and it really hurts because she does want their approval and still somehow thinks she can get it. And through the events of the story, she realizes that that sense of love and affection she's so desperate for, there's another way to get it. Cinderella wants to be friends. If the two of them can get past the barrier being put up by her mother, then she could have real family that loves and supports her. And Cinderella has a new community and a new family now that she's married the prince. And she'd be happy to welcome her stepsister in. We see in Cinderella 2, in Ever After, and in the Bridgerton Show that she can also find love and romance. And those three love interests are actually quite similar to one another. They are all three really nice. Honestly, nice is their main quality before anything else. They are all earnest and they are romantics who really, really like her and aren't afraid to show it in cheesy and conventional ways. And all three of them are significantly less impressive matches than the prince. If you care about how impressive a match is in terms of his wealth and position and physical attractiveness according to the beauty standards, then He is a huge step down from the prince. But in the ways that really matter, he is quite a catch. In fact, in 2 out of those 3 cases, the man has a job, which is more than you can say for 2/3 of the Cinderella prince characters. But the prince is perfect, which means he is absurdly handsome in whatever way the culture defines that, and Cinderella is his perfect match, because she is the most beautiful lady in the land. And the good stepsister and her new boyfriend, I guess, are supposed to match each other in attractiveness? It would seem so, right? It would seem they're at about the same level of attractiveness. But what level is that? It's actually a little bit hard to pin down. All 3 of these are visual works. These are 2 films and a TV show. And you might think that a visual medium is the ideal form for conveying concepts like beauty and ugliness, which are visual. But actually, that's something that those mediums tend to be really bad at. Those are the worst mediums specifically for portraying ugliness. Because if I'm telling you a story and I tell you that these girls are super ugly, you will fill in the blanks with what that means to you. But if you're going to show an ugly character on screen, you have to make some decisions about what ugliness means to you and what it should mean to the audience. So that gives you a bit of a challenge artistically, and also it's a challenge for filmmaking as an industry. For all that Hollywood has a reputation for having no restraint and no morals, that's actually something that the industry seems really reluctant to do, to write a character that is ugly and then portray her that way on screen. I guess it shouldn't be surprising in an industry that's so beauty obsessed and image obsessed. Actor is a job. They don't want to hire people for jobs that aren't pretty. And if they do, it's pretty bad manners to say so out loud, because after all, not being pretty, that's the worst thing you can say about somebody. What you tend to see in film and TV casts are a bunch of people that are basically all extremely attractive. Okay, with some small amounts of variation. And when a role calls for somebody that is not extremely attractive, they will use a vocabulary of markers to identify them to the audience as unattractive without actually having to make them unattractive. There are certain things you can do to break the rules, to violate the letter of the law of the proper beauty standards without actually making somebody less visually appealing. Probably the most recognizable example for female characters would be frizzy hair and glasses. That is the universal language of the before picture. If you take those things off, even with no other changes, you now have an attractive person. Another common example is the nose. Any nose that deviates from the ideal of a tiny button nose. I was going to say a large nose, but it doesn't even have to be large. It just has to be a different size than tiny and have some shape other than button. Another important marker is a round face and unfashionable curves, which mean fat. Like Jacqueline in Ever After. If this was the first movie you ever saw and you didn't have this visual vocabulary, you probably wouldn't realize that this character is supposed to be fat, because Melanie Lynskey is small, but she has a round face and she talks about liking to eat. We're supposed to understand that she's fat. My favorite example of this is Downton Abbey. Edith and Mary are sisters. I'm gonna put a picture of them on the screen. If you haven't seen this show, take a guess at which one of these is supposed to be the pretty sister and which one of these is supposed to be the homely sister. It's really quite interesting because in most other respects, Hollywood in general tends towards a very realist, very literal style. As the audience, we usually have the expectation that, what you see is what you get, that if the filmmaker wants to include some particular element, they've got to go all the way and put it visibly on screen. It's not like theater where we have a high tolerance for shenanigans, where people can freeze or pantomime things. Characters can put on different costume pieces that signify that they are very young or very old, even though we know they clearly aren't. The representation of ugliness, specifically ugly women, is a rare case where the norm in Hollywood is to have a symbol, is to have an indicator instead of having the visual reality. We're supposed to be swept away to a world of imagination where no expense has been spared in visual effects, in scenery, in costuming. It's all so real, it's come alive before our very eyes, except this one thing. In this one case, the norm is for the filmmakers to essentially just put a sign on screen that says this one ugly, and for us all to proceed as though that's the case. Now, I do believe, unfortunately, that this is probably the right choice if you want to keep your audience happy. Audiences want to look at hot people. They do. And they also will feel bad if you go around calling people ugly, because that's very impolite. Maybe this way is better than putting people on screen to make fun of and scorn the way they actually look in real life. I'm reminded of a famous anecdote about the movie Home Alone, when Kevin finds a framed picture of Buzz's girlfriend.
Buzz, your girlfriend. Woof.
The girlfriend in the picture is actually a boy. It is, I believe, the son of somebody involved in the production, and they put him in a wig and dressed him up for the picture, and that is who took the hit. Because the filmmakers thought, reasonably, that it would be really cruel to take a picture of an actual young girl and then do that to her picture. But it's probably not going to bother this boy to say he makes an ugly girl. He'll probably be okay with that. Maybe I'm giving people too much credit, but maybe that spirit is part of why we see these signifiers of unattractiveness rather than actual unattractive people. The filmmakers and the audience would be uncomfortable. It's just cruel. And if you did claim that you were earnestly presenting ugliness on screen, you invite a lot of quibbling about whether or not you really achieved that. In fact, what you would probably end up having to do... Come on. I'm gonna quit. I'm gonna quit YouTube. There we go. If you were a filmmaker making a Cinderella retelling and you wanted your ugly stepsister to be actually ugly, you unfortunately will have to open this box. It's a big box with a lot of stuff in it, and I don't want to go in there. People are in there being racist. In the course of making this video, I myself have been tempted many a time to reach into this box because there's a lot of interesting stuff in there that seems very pertinent, but we can't get into this all today. There's too much stuff. It's outside the scope of this video. But I bet there are some of you listening who felt compelled to object when I even raised the possibility of casting somebody ugly to play the ugly stepsisters, because you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. Everybody's beautiful to somebody. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is so subjective. There's no objectively ugly person. Perhaps whether you fit the dominant beauty standards is objective, but that's a human construct. There's nothing real or essential about that. You can't talk about this for very long before you find yourself confronted with the question of what we mean when we say ugly, and is there such thing as ugliness? If there is such thing as beauty, does that necessarily mean there is such thing as ugliness? And if there is, what is it? Perhaps there is such a thing as ugliness outside of the context of human-created beauty standards. We are drawn to the babbling brook of clear water and repulsed by the pile of rotting garbage. Are there aesthetic truths, aesthetic realities that we can apply to people, or is this just all a construct? We're all just being jerks about this for no reason. We're not going to open the box today, but I did take a peek in there because there's something we do need to acknowledge. This word ugly is in quotes, and whether or not you believe there is a true thing that is ugliness, there are certainly things we call ugly, and it's important to note that they are not random or neutral. In the fairy tales I referenced, for example, beautiful characters were always blonde, and dark-haired characters were always less beautiful. The cues that Hollywood uses to signal to us that somebody is unattractive, things like frizzy and curly hair or large noses, those are not random or neutral. Those are specifically ethnic features. Those are very specifically deviations from the norm of a white beauty standard. Or they could be things like having glasses, having acne, markers of illness, or especially of disability. Because Hollywood does sometimes attempt to show an ugly person on screen and openly call them ugly. And in those cases, it is almost always somebody who has a visible marker of disability, or has some deformity, or has some grave injury. That's why this box is so big. It's full of intersectional analysis. Because it's all commingling in there. Our concepts of desirability and of ability. Our concepts of beauty and of race. It's all... we can't get into it. But I just wanted to acknowledge it's there. That's why sometimes in my recaps, I danced around the concept a little bit. I would say somebody is supposed to be unattractive, or we are told somebody is unattractive. Because a lot of times, the film is just unclear. They are reluctant to put anybody on screen that isn't a 10 out of 10, so you're always kind of guessing who's supposed to be ugly. But also because I'm uncomfortable calling somebody that. I don't want to call somebody ugly, and I don't actually think these people are ugly. But I'll tell you what, if you're unwilling to refer to any person as ugly, and especially if you're unwilling to acknowledge that ugliness exists, you're gonna have a hard time unpacking what's in that box.
What is unsettling about that fairy tale is that it is essentially the story of a household, a world, if you please, of women gathered together and held together in order to abuse another woman. How crippling it must have been for those young girls to grow up with a mother, to watch and imitate that mother, enslaving another girl. I am curious about their fortunes after the story ends. When we're introduced to them, they are beautiful, elegant women of status and clearly women of power. Having watched and participated in the violent domination of another woman, will they be any less cruel when it comes their turn to enslave other children, or even when they are required to take care of their own mother? It is not a wholly medieval problem, it is quite a contemporary one. I want not to ask you, but to tell you not to participate in the oppression of your sisters. In wielding the power that is deservedly yours, don't permit it to enslave your stepsisters. Let your might and your power emanate from that place in you that is nurturing and caring. Women's rights is not only an abstraction, a cause, it is also a personal affair. It is not only about us, it is also about me and you, just the two of us.
The development of the Cinderella tale has been long and complicated, and it didn't end in 1813 or 1894 or 1914. There's no point at which the fairy tale ended, the folklore ended, and we started just rehashing and repeating it. This is a living story that has continued to develop and morph and change in fascinating ways throughout the history of live performance and film and the novel. And that decade, from 1997 to 2007, represented a significant advancement, a significant new addition into the Cinderella cycle, into the Cinderella mythos. Not every Cinderella story has a good stepsister character, but it's now a type. It's now a character that, if you choose, you can include in your particular Cinderella. Isn't that incredible? Isn't it magical to know that we can still do that? Since 2007, we've continued to see pop culture storytellers having fun with the stepsisters, giving us versions of the good stepsisters, or the sort of pathetic, powerless stepsisters, or the protagonist stepsisters. In the late 2010s, we got a resurgence of fairy tale retellings and remixes. Not that these things ever really go out of style, but there are moments where you see a ton at once. The TV show Once Upon a Time, by the time it concluded its run, which included a soft reboot and a spin-off, there were, I believe, 3 separate sets of Cinderella's stepsisters. And some of them are in some way sympathetic. You could probably make a case for 1 or 2 of them being a good stepsister, but at that point, the fairy tales have become so abstracted and remixed that it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to slot them into the traditional story. Around that time, there was also a big trend of fairy tale retellings in YA novels. I know there are many that are Cinderella retellings, so if I had to guess, plenty of them have a good stepsister, but the only one I've read is Cinder, which is a fun sci-fi retelling where Cinderella is a cyborg, and she's got the classic good stepsister. She's got 2, one of them's mean, one of them's nice. I also encountered one recent retelling where there are 2 stepsisters, and both of them are nice. This is If the Shoe Fits by Julie Murphy, which is part of the Meant to Be collection, which is a Disney project. Disney commissioned a bunch of these standalone contemporary romance novels inspired by their classic fairy tale films. And it's kind of the opposite of most Cinderella retellings. Usually, if you want to make a Cinderella story, you want to keep close to the themes and core elements of the story while making sure to scrub any possible Disney IP. If the Shoe Fits is a Disney product, so it can have as many references as it wants. And in fact, having references is kind of the point of the book, so they're all in there. But when you actually look at the story, at the plotline and the themes, it's not really Cinderella at all. This is an entirely different kind of story. So our Cinderella type character is hardworking, and she's really into shoes, and she does have a stepmother and 2 stepsisters who are named after those in the 1950 movie. But without those surface references, I don't think anybody would call this a Cinderella retelling. It's thematically completely unrelated, and you can tell that pretty quick because there is limited weird family stuff. They are All nice. Apparently, we are soon to get more protagonist stepsister characters. There is a Netflix movie in the works called Steps, and there is also a Disney project focusing on the ugly stepsisters. The most notable recent entry into the stepsister canon is 2025's Ugly Stepsister. Now, The Ugly Stepsister is a horror film. It is specifically body horror, so I would like everybody to take a second and tell me that I'm very, very brave for watching it for this project. You are welcome. It's not that it's a bad movie. I think this is quite competent cinema, but I don't, why? Isn't there enough horror in the real world? This movie was written and directed by Norwegian filmmaker Emily Bleichfeldt, and as you might expect, it draws mostly on the Brothers Grimm version of the story, combined with the film conventions of body horror to create something really gross and unsettling. I'm generally very skeptical of movies that rely on female pain as spectacle, but this movie does have a lot to say. This is not a good stepsister story. I would call this a protagonist stepsister story. And you can tell that this movie is aware of and responding to the Cinderellas of 20 years ago and that post-feminist sensibility. Elvira is feeling a lot of pressure from the beauty standards placed on her. They are unfair and they are in many ways violent. But the film is more interested in the moment that she buys into it, that she internalizes these messages, because she is choosing to do it. And she's brave for choosing to do it, isn't she?
You're changing your outside to fit what you already know lives on the inside. You're a brave one.
In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Bleichfeldt talks about the way this film drew on her own experiences, and she says something really interesting. There's only one Cinderella. The rest of us are the ugly stepsister, struggling to fit into the shoe. And ain't that the truth? You know, somehow, however it is that you are born looking naturally, there's always something to fix. Cinderella is about weird family stuff. Do you remember that? It was so long ago now. I know it seems we have strayed far to discuss beauty and virtue, but we have not really strayed far at all, because this all comes back to the family. Because as much as I might relate to these good stepsisters and connect their struggles with beauty to my own encounters with the cosmetic industry or reality TV or mass media, that's not actually what they're dealing with. They aren't failing to live up to the expectations of pop culture or some external figure. They're failing to live up to the expectations of their mom. These girls might experience some rejection outside the home, some other people being mean to them, but that's not really where the issues come from. Their issues were installed and encoded at home by the wicked stepmother. That's what's wrong with them. That's why they don't look right. That's why they aren't being a woman right. Because the stepmother isn't being a mother right. Because the fairy tale always began with parents doing their children wrong, abandoning them or withholding their inheritances or making bad decisions in marriage and then having the gall to die and leave their children to deal with their bad choice in a spouse. These are stories of children who were betrayed by their parents, who either failed to provide for them materially or failed to guide them and mold them in virtue. And now they are coming of age. We see them not when they are children, not when they are well into their middle age. We see them at the cusp of young adulthood, where they suddenly have to decide who they are outside of their parents. And that's something that everybody can relate to. Not everybody relates to Cinderella. Okay, some people do. Some people had childhoods of labor or poverty or physical abuse. Some people do identify with that as a life story of quiet strength in the face of terrible oppression. But plenty of people don't see themselves that way and might be struggling to reconcile an upbringing that included comfort and privilege, but also the inheritance of a lot of dysfunction. Fairy tales are well suited to extreme and broad forms of harm, whereas the novel or the feature film is interested in something a little more nuanced, something more psychological and interior. Those mediums make it possible to tell stories about more insidious kinds of oppression, perhaps about a parent who provided for their child materially, but withheld emotional intimacy or gave them really terrible lessons. The fairy tales might show a parent treating one child well and one child poorly, but in a film that has a good stepsister, now you're telling a story about a dysfunctional family system, a situation where physically leaving the house does not magically make all your problems go away. What happens when your view of yourself, of your virtue and vices, of your beauty and ugliness, was taught to you by a parent that was wrong? What happens when your parents are wrong about who they say you are? It's a crucial question of coming of age. When do we become responsible for recognizing that we have been taught something that's wrong? How do we create our own identities outside of our role in the family? What are our obligations to our family members? How do you forge an adult relationship with a family member when you grew up in different positions in a toxic family dynamic? Can you keep a relationship with a sibling if you've cut off the parent that connected you? What is forgivable and what isn't?
And in my happiness, I forgive you all.
Does forgiveness make you strong, or does it make you a doormat?
All I ask, your majesties, is that you show her the same courtesy that she has bestowed upon me.
What do we risk by doing the right thing? Why do we sometimes choose safety over what we know is right? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect each other? Who decides who we are? How do we know if we are virtuous? How do we know if we are beautiful?
You decide what's right. You decide what's good.
Perhaps it's not always constructive to think of ourselves as Cinderella, to think of ourselves completely and utterly as a victim. Perhaps it's helpful to remember that we are more like the good stepsister, that we are capable of being harmed and of harming others, just as we are capable of love and capable of being loved. And I like the classic Cinderella. I like her pretty dress and her shiny shoes. But I think that's a much better story. And you know what the king does? He starts monologuing. He delivers a full soliloquy to the shoe that I'm absolutely obsessed with and will now read for you in its entirety. I must emphasize there's very little dialogue in these stories, and usually it's like a short sentence at a time. To have a whole speech is very uncommon, but apparently Basile felt it was worth it for this poetry. If the foundation is so beautiful, what must be the house? O beauteous candlestick, which holdest the candle that consumeth me, O trivet of the beauteous kettle where boileth my life, O fine cloth, to which is tied the net of love, wherewith thou hast caught this soul, I embrace thee, and hold thee to my bosom. And if I cannot have the tree, I worship the root. And if I cannot have the capital, I kiss the foundation. Thou wert the covering for a white foot, and now art thou the pulley of this blackened heart. By thee stood thy fellow, an inch tall and more, who is the tyrant of this life of mine, and by thee groweth so much sweetness in my soul, whilst I gaze upon thee and possess thee. If you guys were looking for a new audition cut, you know, if you need your two contrasting monologues, there's your drama.